October the 21st, 1805. Off the Cape of Trafalgar in the unforgiving North Atlantic, British warships are locked in a savage battle with a combined French and Spanish fleet. It was to prove a crushing British victory, but the price would be the death of the Royal Navy's most celebrated commander, Horatio Nelson.
Nelson had a huge sense of destiny. He had this sense that he was going to die a hero. He was going to die a hero in his greatest victory.
The victory ensured Britain's supremacy at sea for more than a century. But things could have been very different. Was Napoleon's Franco-Spanish fleet closer to victory at Trafalgar than historians have previously claimed?
It was a very close-run thing. The French and the Spanish fought with far greater gallantry, far more determination than the British had expected.
Now, new technology and groundbreaking historical detective work are shedding crucial new light on the Battle of Trafalgar and the qualities of a man remembered as the greatest naval leader in history. Just how much did Nelson risk at the Battle of Trafalgar? In 1805, Europe had been engulfed in war for nearly a decade. Napoleon dominated mainland Europe and was poised to invade his most bitter enemy, Britain. But crossing the English Channel, French troopships would be vulnerable to attack from British warships. And so Napoleon combined the French fleet with that of Allied Spain in order to protect the invasion force. Knowing that destruction of this combined fleet was the key to averting invasion, Nelson and other British admirals pursued and blockaded the French and Spanish, trying desperately to bring them to a decisive battle. By October 1805, after nearly 2 years at sea, Nelson had the combined fleet cornered at Cadiz, near Gibraltar.
Other admirals instituted close blockades, so they would almost literally block the French fleet up in harbour. Nelson took the exact contrary view, and he instituted loose blockade, whereby he was encouraging the French to come out, and he would then be able to bring them to battle and defeat them.
The events surrounding the resultant battle have become legendary. Nelson conceived an elaborate, daring new plan of attack and carefully orchestrated the battle. The boldness of the plan and Nelson's charismatic leadership ensured the defeat of Napoleon's combined fleet. Because it was such a resounding victory, Trafalgar is often regarded as a foregone conclusion. But the latest research is showing that Britain's most famous naval triumph was anything but inevitable. In the long months of blockade that preceded Trafalgar, Nelson had come under severe political pressure. The British government desperately needed a victory.
Clearly, Nelson wanted a major battle of annihilation. He recognized that there needed to be a victory to help buoy up the coalition, because it was quite likely Napoleon would do quite well on land. He had a habit of doing that. Therefore, the British had to demonstrate as dramatically as possible that they were dominant at sea. And no matter how many times Napoleon might win on land, he couldn't win the war.
But most large-scale naval actions at this time were anything but decisive.
The traditional form of naval battle was both sides to form in a single line, and 2 lines to come up against each other like that and fire at each other. Now, the problem with that type of battle was usually it was very indecisive. It might last for perhaps even several days in some cases, with neither side actually winning a victory. Nelson's idea was to develop a battle that would ensure a victory.
Instead of the usual linear approach, Nelson decided to attack head-on with his ships in columns to break the line of the French and Spanish fleet and provoke a decisive close-quarter battle. But there was a drawback to this tactic.
To actually sail into an enemy line meant you were vulnerable to all the ships in the line as you came in. So it was a calculated risk. But Nelson knew that if you did manage to penetrate an enemy line with the wind behind you, the enemy would have great difficulties getting away, and that you could bring on what he always called a pell-mell battle. It was, in many respects, a very reckless gamble.
Historians have always believed that such a radical approach must have been carefully prepared before the battle. Until recently, there was only anecdotal evidence for this, including accounts of Nelson explaining his plan to colleagues and friends throughout 1805. But at the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, a major new clue has been found. Colin White was conducting routine research into the 5,000 or so documents in the Nelson papers when he made an amazing discovery.
I came across a list of names on a fairly small piece of paper. It was a list of favours that he wanted to get for protégés of his. And then, as one is always taught to do, I turned it over.
On the back was a small pen and ink sketch, strikingly similar to the layout of the Battle of Trafalgar. It showed a single line representing an enemy fleet, with Nelson's fleet in 3 divisions breaking through at right angles. Far from a highly elaborate and detailed plan, the diagram is little more than a brief sketch. But Colin believes it also holds a vital clue as to Nelson's state of mind as he prepared for the battle.
This is the excitement of this particular diagram. This is not a carefully drawn battle plan with "this is my plan for the Battle of Trafalgar" on it. This is a very quick thumbnail sketch done to accompany a conversation. And in fact, right in the centre there, you can see that he's got so excited in saying that he's going to drive through the line that he's dug into the page and the ink has blotted.
The emphatic gesture suggests Nelson's desperation to finally defeat the combined fleet at sea, even if it meant acting impulsively with only the barest notion of a plan. It was a considerable gamble, and Nelson's flamboyant, maverick character was crucial to the plan.
Nelson had an immense ego, but he moderated that by a great dash of humanity. He was quite clearly loved by many people, and not just Lady Hamilton. He was a very popular commander, and he had a charisma which the men could easily see, and therefore he was able to get from his men and from his fleets a performance which perhaps no other officer could.
Always leading from the front, Nelson was no stranger to extreme personal danger. He'd been wounded several times in previous battles, losing his right arm at Tenerife. But the British would need more than their admiral's legendary charisma, for they were about to fight the most technologically advanced and powerful fleet in the world. By October 1805, the British Navy under Admiral Horatio Nelson is blockading Napoleon's combined French and Spanish fleet at Cadiz in southwestern Spain. In command of the combined fleet was the French Admiral Pierre Villeneuve. He was under pressure from Napoleon. If the British Navy was not defeated before winter, his planned invasion of Britain would have to be abandoned. Time was running out. So though there were signs the weather was about to worsen, Villeneuve ordered his fleet to sea.
Here we are, dawn, October 21st, 1805, a date that will forever after live in the history of the Royal Navy. I'm standing just behind the British fleet, 27 ships of the line, the largest ones with 100 guns, the smallest with 64. And ahead of them, lit by the Iberian sunrise coming up in the east behind me, is what they've been waiting for and looking for. The Franco-Spanish fleet, 33 ships of the line, stretching really from one side of the horizon to the other. It looks like a formidable array of fighting power, but to Nelson, it's a target, inviting destruction.
The target included some of the most technologically advanced ships in the world. The French Navy in particular had conducted extensive research into hydrodynamics and ship design.
In the last century or so, from about 1730, the French had a reputation for building very good ships. The French ships tended to have finer lines underwater. They were slightly faster in good weather conditions. And the reason was that the French would stay in port till they saw an opportunity. They would then come out and make a quick dash for wherever they were trying to go.
The Spanish, too, were well equipped with powerful ships, designed to protect convoys to their South American colonies.
Regarding the ship of the Spanish fleet, they made superb, well-designed ships, combining the gunnery power and the sailing facilities. It was a long research for decades to find out the middle way between a good machine for the combat and at the same time a good machine for the winds and the storms.
As well as superior design qualities, the combined fleet had another advantage over the British.
By Trafalgar, the British had 27 ships of the line. These were the big fighting ships, the equivalent of battleships perhaps in the 20th century. And the French and Spanish combined had 33. So they had really, technically, they had a substantially stronger fleet.
Was Nelson overconfident in taking on such a powerful force? What was it about the British Navy that Nelson had so much trust in? HMS Unicorn is the oldest British-built warship still afloat. Most of the remaining ships from this era have been completely restored by modern craftsmen. But miraculously, Unicorn has survived intact. Although she was built after the Napoleonic Wars, her design principles are identical to many of Nelson's ships at Trafalgar. Maritime archaeologists Robert Prescott and Dan Atkinson are experts on wooden-built sailing vessels. They're conducting a painstaking study of Unicorn to discover more about shipbuilding in the British Navy of Nelson's time. All over the ship are unique details of the lost art of wooden ship construction, from aspects of overall design to individual methods of timber jointing. But the evidence Robert and Dan are most interested in lies in the strange rune-like carvings embedded in the ship's beams and planking. These are the shipwrights marks, evidence of the individual craftsmen who built Nelson's navy.
The timber marks actually are a lovely indication of a sort of secret language within the dockyard, where the marks are actually understood within the working processes of the yard between the shipwrights and the officers who are superintending the works that are happening in the yard. And this is where it really starts happening, isn't it? Well, it's really the beams that we've been concentrating on, isn't it?
Their research has led Dan and Robert to believe that this secret language was evolving rapidly in Britain during the Napoleonic Wars. Nowhere more so than the place where Unicorn herself was built, the Royal Dockyard at Chatham in Kent. The largest of all the British shipyards, Chatham produced many of the ships in Nelson's fleet at Trafalgar, including his flagship, HMS Victory. An extraordinary discovery here ties in with Robert and Dan's research on board Unicorn. During recent restoration work, a number of massive timber beams were found preserved beneath a 200-year-old floor. More than 160 specimens were eventually recovered. They were identified as the framework of an early 19th century warship. It's a mystery why this particular ship was preserved disassembled in this way. But one advantage of this is that shipwrights' marks, similar to those on Unicorn, are more exposed.
This has this nice race mark here. This is carved by a shipwright using a race tool or a race knife. You see it's got a series of Roman numerals here. This is all part of the business of helping other shipwrights to understand where this is destined to go. They communicate with each other using these markings which they leave all over the place.
These race marks would have enabled shipwrights to quickly reassemble the vessel like a prefabricated kit.
We're beginning to see a measure of standardization here, and people are very careful to mark their work so that when it's sent from the carpenter's shop down to the ways where the shipwrights assemble the ship, everybody knows where it's going. This is the starboard hand end of the beam, and it's beam number 23, so that's the station mark along the length of the ship. But perhaps the most remarkable thing is down here, where you have die-stamped initials that have been struck in the end of the timber with a metal die. And we find this in a number of pieces throughout here. We have a series of sets of initials. There's a very sophisticated system of timber management emerging here, which enables the shipwrights in different parts of the yard to communicate with each other and understand exactly what's required of them.
This growing standardization meant that at the time of Trafalgar, the British Navy's shipbuilding and maintenance was becoming increasingly efficient. After months, even years at sea, British blockade ships could be effectively maintained by highly versatile dockyards. What the British fleet's warships lacked in size and speed, they made up for by being more practical and better maintained than those of their French and Spanish enemies. But there were more French and Spanish ships, and so they had more guns than the British. Nelson knew that his best chance was to create chaos, the pell-mell battle he'd been planning for months. The British fleet would have to sail directly into the enemy guns.
On the day of the battle itself, everyone in the British fleet knows that the battle is in the offing, because they know that the enemy fleet is out, and they know that their admiral is going to go after it. And so the ships are then signalled to get into two lines. He decides to go with two lines. There's an enormous sense of speed in this, because he wants to get the enemy as off balance as possible.
Nelson lacked sufficient ships for the 3 lines as he'd originally planned. Attacking regardless with only 2 made his tactics even riskier. Around midday, the attacking British ships are forming 2 ragged columns as they begin the long, exposed charge into the Franco-Spanish line.
Here we are, the British attack has begun. The 2 lines are formed. Nelson's line here, led by Victory. Collingwood's line here, led by Royal Sovereign. The other ships behind, more or less in formation. The plan now is to strike through the enemy line, get on the other side, where it's hard for the enemy to escape, and bring on what Nelson always called a pell-mell action.
The radical new battle tactic put not only Nelson's ships at enormous risk, but also his own personal safety.
There was a great deal of jostling for the head of the columns. Collingwood was leading his column, and Nelson was leading his. And the ships astern of Nelson, particularly HMS Temeraire, was trying to get past. And there's a famous moment where the Temeraire looked as if she was about to overtake the Victory, and Nelson comes out onto the deck and shouts at the captain, "I'll thank you, Captain Harvey, to keep your proper station, which is astern of the Victory." So there's that almost sense of excitement and jockeying going on, like knights riding in a cavalry charge.
The head-on charge meant the British ship's sails would be fully exposed, square on to the combined fleet. This played straight into the hands of the French and Spanish gunners.
What the French and Spanish are trying to do, the French in particular, I think, is to go for the enemy's sails, go for the rigging, so they try and dismast the ships. This is what we would now call a mobility kill.
As the British advanced, the flagship Victory and the other lead ships were defenseless, their own guns unable to bear on their enemy. What's more, the weather was changing and unusually calm winds made it agonizingly slow, no more than walking pace. Just how much of a risk was this? One way to find out is to establish how much cannon fire the Victory and Nelson were exposed to. To find out, Robert Prescott is making a study of the last surviving, truly original part of Nelson's flagship, HMS Victory. More than 50 feet wide, this sail would have been the main aiming point for the combined fleet gunners as Victory approached. It's a unique relic and still bears the battle scars of Trafalgar. Robert will conduct a survey of the damage in order to quantify how much and what types of enemy fire Victory sustained.
Taking this hull, for example.
Yeah, this is an interesting one, isn't it?
It's sort of got two straight lines, and yet the rest of it is pretty much curved. Have we got any ideas on that?
Well, one thing we have to be aware of is that the combined fleet will have been using a number of different projectiles.
Yes.
It'll been using round shot, and we would hope that one sees a fairly discreet puncturing of the sail with that. But they were also using chain shot and bar shot.
But some of the holes in the sail look distinctly odd. They're nothing like depictions of cannon-damaged sails in period paintings. It's possible that some of this damage may have been caused after the battle by souvenir hunters.
In a way, this looks very much as if it might be one of those, because that looks like a very straight cut edge. There's no fraying of the margins at all. I mean, a well-sharpened seaman's knife might well have done that.
Robert will first have to try and establish how much of the damage is original from the battle. The only way to do that is to inflict some damage of his own. On board the Victory, Nelson is racing headlong into the attack on the French and Spanish combined fleet. He's outnumbered and outgunned. How can we discover just how much of a risk Nelson was running? Robert Prescott wants to find out how much of the damage on Victory's foretopsail was caused by enemy cannon fire. This will enable him to assess how much fire Nelson exposed himself to. He's commissioned a sample sail made from flax canvas, exactly the same as Victory's foretopsail.
And although this is a really very small sail by the standards of the foretopsail, it is made in exactly the same way, made of the standard cloths, 2 foot in width, seamed up with a nice double seam here, and suspended by row bands from a spar. It's looking very good just now. Quite pleased with the way that's setting.
To reconstruct the kind of damage incurred at Trafalgar, Robert enlists the aid of cannon expert Colonel Simon West. French and Spanish gunners used various types of ammunition against enemy ships. The most basic was solid iron round shot.
Stand by. 3, 2, 1, fire.
Perfect. Absolutely perfect. That is actually very interesting from our point of view, because you can see the impact of the ball, but you can also see this tearing right,
it's fascinating,
horizontal and vertical tearing. There's an awful lot of that sort of damage on the sail.
That on its own isn't a very effective shot, is it? I mean, from my
really.
point of view, you're not seeing something that's stopping the function of
Yes.
of the piece of equipment.
round shot would be effective in a lucky hit on a ship's mast. But other types of projectile were more suited against canvas and rope. Bar shot was designed to spin in flight, slicing through a wider area than round shot.
Stand by. 3, 2, 1, fire.
But in this case, the range is too short for the bar shot to begin to spin, so it creates less destruction than expected.
From the look of the hull, it looks like a similar rip to the ones we had before. That said, if it hit something hard, like a mast, it would probably then immediately start spinning, and obviously there's lots more rigging in and amongst it. So it may just need that first impact to get it spinning and then rip through other material around.
A development on bar shot was the deadliest of all the projectiles the French and Spanish used. Chain shot.
Now the chain shot is simply two projectiles chained together, and this would have been left in on casting. They travel up the bore together, and as soon as they come out of the muzzle, they separate and will be immediately unstable and start spinning.
Stand by. 3, 2, 1, fire.
But you can see that the chain's fully extended at this point.
In fact, you can even see marks from
the chain. Yes, yes.
In fact, the chain, you can see the chain has ripped.
Yes, that's
all
right.
the way down.
Yeah.
So it's
like a cheese wire.
It wouldn't take many shots like that to reduce the power the sail is transmitting to the boat.
First one is the top hole there, the top smudge.
The top smudge. So that's number 3 there.
Back at their base in Chatham, Robert and Dan record and analyse the damage on the sample sail. Each type of projectile has produced a different damage signature, which Robert compares with foretopsail damage.
Yeah, we have to do that, that's true. And many of those odd shapes, which people perhaps in the past have thought were not related to shot damage on Victory's foretopsail, I suspect are now, because one of the things that's so striking is the way the impact of the round shot in particular tears the warp and the weft of the sail and produces a lot of triangular shapes, very much the same as the ones we see on the Victory foretopsail.
Straight edges.
Yeah. Now that we know the kind of damage that we were able to produce in the experiment, if we go back to the foretopsail and we look at the damage which that has suffered, I think we can clearly identify those parts which are battle-related and those which are not. And in my view, it is very much the case that a good deal of that is battle-related and not souvenir-taking at all, much more battle damage to that sail than perhaps we had previously accepted.
The test has confirmed documentary accounts of the huge amount of firepower Victory sustained in the battle. If a single gun can inflict this amount of damage with only a few shots, Nelson and Victory were at huge risk from hundreds of French and Spanish cannons firing unopposed for 20 minutes. At around 30 minutes after noon, Victory smashed through the French and Spanish line.
Here we are, the point of contact. Up here, Collingwood ships are already engaged in their melee at the back end of the Franco-Spanish line. But here is Nelson's flagship. He's moving through the line with the enemy flagship on his left. As he passes in Victory, her guns, double, triple-shotted perhaps, fire a raking broadside right through the French flagship that causes horrendous casualties as these cannonballs bounce their way down through the French ship.
Despite the huge risk, Nelson had succeeded in bringing on a pell-mell battle, and the French and Spanish had failed to stop the British attack. Now, as the two fleets came to close action, everything would depend on the fighting prowess of individual crews. But for months leading up to Trafalgar, the combined fleet had been trapped at the Spanish port of Cadiz. Many crews were confined to their ships in the harbour. But in the old city, it's still possible to see the cramped tenements where many French and Spanish seamen were quartered in squalid conditions.
The streets here in Cadiz, of course, were full of sailors at the time. There were cafes just like now, drinking spots, and other spots where sailors like to congregate, chasing the women and all the rest of it. It was quite an intrusion, and you had them by the thousands.
Maritime historian René Chartrand believes this long confinement in harbour had serious consequences for both French and Spanish crews.
The training regime would have been minimal because of the possibilities of this place. You can't really fire powder and ball here, and so the training regime will tend to be going up and down the mast and so on, but otherwise very minimal. Of course, you get eventually half-trained crews.
But for the French Navy in particular, Cadiz was merely the last in a long line of catastrophes dating back to before the war with Britain. Only 20 years before Trafalgar, the French Navy had been at the height of its power. But everything changed in 1789 with the French Revolution.
The French officer corps was literally guillotined, and those that weren't left the country. There was tremendous technical neglect. The ships were left to basically rot in the harbors. A fleet is a very, very complicated thing, and it's a very technical thing that you don't neglect for 10 years. And of course, that's what they'd done. They neglected the fleet to an almost irreparable state.
But what of the other half of the combined fleet? The Spanish had no shortage of officers, and they were at least as well trained as officers in the British Navy, aided by the renowned academy at San Fernando. Why then were the Spanish ships of the combined fleet not more effective against the British?
We know that crewing of the Spanish ships in particular had been a problem. We know, for example, that some of the larger ships simply had, instead of sailors, they had army conscripts on board, firing the guns and so on.
But what could have caused the Spanish Navy's chronic manpower shortage? It was whilst researching Spanish climatological records for Trafalgar that meteorologist Dennis Wheeler made a chance discovery. Yellow fever.
This is a report published in Gibraltar on epidemic diseases, but in particular on yellow fever, contagious fevers in general. Fortunately for us, published in 1806. So this will have an account of the events of 1804 and indeed previous years to that, when yellow fever would have been sweeping through Andalusia.
Cadiz was badly affected by this epidemic, but just how crucial it was to the outcome of the Battle of Trafalgar only became clear when Dennis Wheeler met local historian Dr. Sam Bernardi.
And there's been passing references to outbreaks of yellow fever and similar diseases in the early 19th century. Is there any evidence from the statistics you've got to hand to suggest that there might have been a particular influence on people in military service at the time?
Well, it was curious that of, I think it was something like 2,800 deaths reported in Cadiz in 1804, only 200 were women, which suggests to me that the epidemic might have, if these figures are right, might have occurred in some sort of barracks area where there were only men.
In Cadiz, before Trafalgar, thousands of Frenchmen and Spaniards were still recovering from this epidemic. Nearly 3,000 had already died. Though Nelson could not have known it, the combined fleet was nowhere near full strength or efficiency. 30 minutes in, and the battle has become a series of savage individual duels between ships. The British are gaining the upper hand, but Nelson himself faces a stern challenge.
Coming up here is the important vessel, the French counterattack, Captain Lucas's Redoutable, the best-handled ship in the fleet. These two ships clash together. It's the closest of close actions, the signal which is still flying until it gets shot away from the masts of Victory. But Captain Lucas of Redoutable has his mast festooned with musketeers. They are going to make life quite literally impossible on the upper deck of Victory, and Nelson's personal fate is about to be decided.
The extraordinary French captain Jean-Jacques Lucas of the Redoutable was in a class apart.
Lucas was one of the few French captains who'd actually thought about the battle in advance. And so, ironically, the Victory comes up against the one ship that can really deal her a serious blow.
Lucas' battle plan was to engage as close as he could, and, if possible, board the largest possible ship that he could lay his hand on. And he had trained his men for this, trained them to hope for this, and by George, it happened.
While blockaded in Cadiz, Captain Lucas had trained his men ceaselessly till they were experts in boarding and musketry. But he had also trained them in the use of a far more devastating weapon. He knew that these primitive, hand-thrown grenades would prove highly effective at close quarters.
As the Victory comes alongside and gets locked together with her, the Redoutable shuts all her lower gun ports. The men from the lower gun ports are brought up onto the upper deck. There are men in the rigging as well, and they concentrate on firing on the Victory's upper deck.
Now, there was Lucas' ship, which was a 74, a smaller ship than the Victory, certainly, but that didn't matter to him, because once they got in close to the Victory, within a few minutes, the decks of the Victory were practically emptied of men.
He'd survived the French and Spanish cannon fire, but faced with this furious close-range assault, Nelson was again in deadly peril.
Virtually nothing could live on the upper deck of Victory. The hail of fire that French ship had brought to bear was such that nothing could live there. It either had to take refuge or it died.
By 1 p.m., Redoutable's crew had turned Victory's upper deck into a smouldering ruin. And right in the midst of this chaos, in full view of the enemy, Nelson still paces the quarterdeck. He's dangerously, almost suicidally exposed.
There is a traditional view, almost a legend, of the death of Nelson, that there he is, slightly vain, covered in his orders and so on, an absolutely sitting duck.
Suddenly, as Nelson and his second-in-command turn, Nelson falls, struck by a single bullet. Though he's still conscious, it's clear to all around that their charismatic admiral is dying. Legend has it that one of Lucas' sharpshooters was able to identify Nelson because of the sparkling orders on his jacket. But how much of this legend is true?
If you look at Nelson's uniform in the National Maritime Museum, it's his rather threadbare working rig. Of course he had his orders on it, but they were embroidered, they weren't shining.
If he were not so visible as previously thought, could Nelson have been singled out by a French marksman, the way the legend suggests? By 2 p.m., the Battle of Trafalgar is swinging in favor of the British fleet. But Britain's Admiral Horatio Nelson, who had led the British attack, lies dying. Is it possible that his reckless plan for the battle has led directly to his own death?
In trying to understand how Nelson came to be shot, one needs to think oneself into the situation on the quarterdeck of the Victory on the 21st of October 1805. The Victory's upper deck is being swept by a swathe of bullets from all different positions and places.
At the scene of the shooting, the quarterdeck of HMS Victory, now moored in the English port of Portsmouth, a team of experts has assembled. They'll try to establish whether Nelson was killed by a deliberately aimed marksman's shot or simply by chance in the chaos of battle.
So far as we know, Hardy and Nelson were pacing down the middle of the deck here. Nelson on the right, Hardy on the left. The custom would be to pace together and to turn inwards so you could continue the conversation and then go back down this way. These guns are all firing. You've got a ship over there firing at you. You've got all the rigging in the way. So there's a huge amount of baffle. Yet this chap is supposed to be able to accurately spot that it's the Admiral and hit him from a distance of 40 yards when he's moving. I just find it difficult to believe that it was deliberately aimed.
Allowing for battle conditions, could it have been possible for a marksman to pick Nelson out individually on the quarterdeck? The team bring in period firearms expert Ivan Williams. He'll use exactly the same kind of smoothbore musket as used by Lucas's men on the Redoutable. But instead of musket balls, Ivan will use the latest Swedish military technology to measure his accuracy. The musket has been fitted with a small arms transmitter, or SAT. It's a weapon effect simulator, as used in training by the British Army. On the range with live rounds, Ivan ensures the musket's lethal accuracy. He and combat simulator expert Martin Ernesson then zero in the SAT. Triggered by a blank round, the SAT fires a laser representing the path of the bullet. If Ivan's on target, the receiver vest indicates a hit. From Nelson's position when he was hit and the detail on the wound, the team first attempt to establish what direction the bullet came from.
So if we're going through the back of that vertebra and we know that it's fairly close to the shoulder tip, if his shoulder was hunched forward a little bit more, we're looking at an angle that is perhaps shallower than people imagine.
Well, fascinatingly, you are pointing straight up at where the mizzen top would have been, in my opinion.
This matches exactly with surviving eyewitness accounts, which describe where the shot came from. Ivan will shoot from the approximate position of Redoutable's mizzen top, 20 meters above Victory's quarterdeck.
Killed. Killed. Wounded. Right arm. Killed.
9 out of 10 shots are on target, 7 of them fatal. Do the team believe Nelson could have been deliberately shot?
Having seen our friend walk through in the manner he did, and he was killed twice out of twice, my view is that I reckon that it was an aim shot.
I am definitely not convinced, even though he got those kills, that it was on the day an aimed shot. I still think that there was just so much fire being aimed on this spot that he was going to get shot anyway.
The adrenaline up there would be considerable, however calm and used to it they were. And you have to say that it could have been an aim shot. You can, like Thomas Plunkett in the Rifles, you can never say it can't.
The weight of evidence suggests it's highly likely Nelson was felled by a deliberately aimed shot. Even without the conspicuous orders on his uniform, he was still extremely vulnerable. Given that Redoutable's men had already killed or wounded more than 50 of Victory's crew on the exposed deck, Nelson was lucky to have survived as long as he did.
Now the battle is over, and here we have the chaos of a pell-mell action, a melee. The ships are all over the place, the ordered lines have gone. But note, every Franco-Spanish ship has a British ship alongside. This is a great and glorious victory. 18 ships of the line are now captured by the British. This is one of the greatest victories in naval history.
But hundreds of sailors, French, English and Spanish, lay dead on battered ships. Survivors felt themselves lucky to be alive. But for many, the ordeal was only beginning.
While the battle's being fought, the seas are getting higher. Nelson knows there's a storm coming in off the open Atlantic. Therefore, he leaves strict orders that after the battle, the fleet should go to anchor to weather this storm.
This was difficult enough for the British, but most of the combined fleet ships they had captured as prizes were severely battle damaged. It was no way to face a storm.
To be anchored, to be secure, night time's coming, a storm's on its way, is really all you could hope for in terms of security. They weren't able to do it. They didn't have the anchors, they didn't have the cables. In some cases, they didn't have the manpower.
Nelson had chosen to fight the battle, knowing it was a race against the weather. Once again, he had run a terrible risk. Even though the British fleet had won a victory, the survivors were now horribly exposed to a nightmarish storm. If the British fleet were lost, the victory would count for nothing. All but 4 of the 18 captured ships sank. More than 2,000 men who had survived the battle were lost at sea.
On the 22nd of October, the people in Cadiz saw a very horrible landscape. On the beaches, they saw corpses, mast, rigging, waste of the combined fleet.
Nelson won a crushing victory at Trafalgar, but had risked everything to achieve it. With a hazardous and impulsive plan, Nelson steered his fleet directly into a storm of fire. Fortunately for the British fleet, which had already secured victory, Nelson's death came too late to affect the final outcome of the battle. But his gamble with the weather was the greatest risk of all, and could have led to the loss of the British fleet itself. Nelson's place in history was assured. At a price of more than 5,000 Spanish, French, and British lives. They lie still in the treacherous dark waters off Cape Trafalgar. The Battle of Hastings in 1066 is the most famous battle ever fought on English soil. The Bayeux tapestry shows William of Normandy defeating King Harold of England. 2 different leaders, 2 very different styles of fighting.
This creature is for one purpose only, dealing death.
Historians have always said that William won because he was a better general. But was his victory inevitable? No clues have ever been found on the battlefield. So researchers are now using a surprising array of unusual specialist techniques to investigate what really happened.
What we really need to do is to peel back the layers from the modern world and get back to the landscape of 1066.
Using their new findings, experts are piecing together the real story of 1066. Was William's victory at Hastings down to military skill, or just good luck? On October the 14th, 1066, Harold, King of England, went into battle against William, Duke of Normandy. On this hill near Hastings, a modern Norman army of knights on horseback defeated a traditional Anglo-Saxon army of foot soldiers protected only by shields. Thousands died in one of the longest battles in medieval history. And at the end of the day, William was the new king of England.
Harold, you've probably heard of him. He's the guy that got the arrow in the eye. He was a good soldier.
The detective work begins in the world of modern business.
And the chairman was a frightfully nice chap.
Can management theory shed new light on whether William was the better general?
What we're going to do is make some analogies between modern business with mergers, acquisitions, takeovers, and what happened 1,000 years ago with the hostile takeover of a company called England.
Stephen Carver teaches project management at one of Europe's leading business schools.
First of all, Harold. 6'2" tall, mustachioed, dashing, women loved him. He'd been deputy head of England under his father. The positive side of that was that he was actually respected by his staff. He'd been a line manager, he'd worked his way up. Now, William, a completely, totally different guy. You'll notice the finger here on the Bayeux tapestry. Yes, this guy liked using his finger. I have a plan, I am right, you are wrong, we are going to do it my way. He was unstoppable. He always had a plan, and he had a plan to back up the plan, to back up the plan in case the plan went wrong. So, his official court title was William the Bastard. Now, can you imagine as a child being referred to officially as William the Bastard? You know, William the Bastard, come over here. The guy was balanced, he had ships on both shoulders.
In the business world, it's important to know your competitor's history. William and Harold had actually met 2 years earlier. Harold had been shipwrecked off the northern French coast, and William had rescued him.
Rescue in inverted commas. It was pretty obvious that Harold basically had no way out. He wasn't going to leave Normandy alive unless he gave William what he wanted. And really, William was doing this to find out what made Harold tick. What sort of soldier was he?
When Edward the Confessor died and Harold took the crown, William prepared to invade England. Harold called up an army to confront him. By July, Harold's army occupied the south coast of England, and William had assembled his fleet in Normandy. A good general proves himself not only in battle, but also in the months beforehand. Preparation is vitally important.
You can look back at a logistic commander and see if his logistics supported his mission properly. Often, poor logistics is one of the crucial reasons why an operation doesn't succeed.
Colonel Paul Budd plans British Army campaigns today. He deals with the same basic problems as they would have done in 1066. Can he tell whether William was better prepared for the battle?
We're looking for about 2,500 calories a man day. So if we input some of the ingredients here, for example, the barley, oats, leeks seems to have been a commonly available ingredient, onions.
A major part of successful logistics is being able to supply food. So who managed better, Harold or William?
As William was going to invade across the Channel, he would have had to have taken a far more centralist view of his logistic planning.
This is exactly what William did. He paid for everything himself and fed his men from a central base. In contrast, Harold's army, known as the Fyrd, was a kind of national service where each soldier brought 2 months' supply of food with him.
Harold relied on his Fyrd coming in, probably supporting themselves in small village groups, and therefore he would have been able to have a far more flexible logistic organisation and be able to respond and change his forces probably more easily.
Harold actually had a better way of keeping his army going. However, the time of year was crucial. In the medieval world, July was the month when food was most scarce. And this was precisely the moment William chose to get his fleet together. did clever timing give William the edge?
For Harold, during August, there would have been a great deal of psychological pressure on his soldiers to want to return home and join in the harvest. From William's perspective, September was the optimum time to attack England, and for him there was the greatest chance of being able to pillage local supplies and replenish his own larders.
By September the 8th, the Anglo-Saxons had used up all their food, and Harold had to disband his army. It looks like William had proved the better planner, as just 4 days later, with Harold at his most vulnerable, William set sail for England. Most of what we know about the events of 1066 comes from a medieval strip cartoon. Although it's called the Bayeux Tapestry, it is in fact an embroidery. But can we rely on this ancient wall hanging as historical evidence?
Here is a lovely little touch. 2 female centaurs with flowing blonde hair and welcoming arms. Centaurs were well known as symbols of lust, and this is the hunt here, where 2 men are running with clubs, but also this chap's showing his genitals here, quite clearly. So that is another little rude remark about King William's laws on hunting. I've studied it quite clearly under a microscope, in fact, and it's clearly his bits and pieces all hanging down.
Jan Messent has spent years working out how the tapestry was made. She knows the secret of why it can be taken seriously as evidence. It's not just that it was made within 4 years of the battle. It's also the fact of who made it.
This is exactly the kind of woman who would have been embroidering this actual scene. They were noble women. Their husbands had been fighting and killed on the battlefield at Hastings. It sounds rather strange that Anglo-Saxon women would be making a Norman hanging for perhaps a Norman man, giving a Norman version of the events. I don't think that they would have seen it as anything but a fair representation of how brave their own menfolk were and how well they fought.
Jan has also discovered when the tapestry's evidence should not be taken literally.
When you begin to take the tapestry apart, and there are 7 joins in it, then you begin to realize that each of the 8 sections were done in a different venue. The woman who embroidered this yellow horse began to embroider over the join without realizing that the next horse to her is also yellow. So it's got yellow chest and legs, and the rest of it is brown. That simply happened because there was a join and because she hadn't seen what was actually happening on the next piece.
So the tapestry's evidence can only be relied on in parts. Some of its details are accurate, others are mistakes. And sometimes bits of information are simply left out. The scene of William's preparations, followed by his ships crossing the channel, is a perfect example. It looks like after months of planning, William had waited for just the right moment to pounce. But had he?
The Arda Sun, Dover Coast Guard, good afternoon, sir.
Medieval scholars Gerald and Christine Grange have scoured one of the earliest written accounts of the campaign, known as the Carmen of Hastings.
And your destination, over.
They have compared its descriptions of weather to wind patterns in the Channel today. Their research is making clear just how much control over his campaign William really had.
In 1066, William clearly was still at the mercy of the winds. Honestly, one can say that even a modern yachtsman would reckon to be at the mercy of the winds. The Normans would be using Viking-type double-ended ships with a single square sail for their invasion crossing. you'd be looking ideally for a southerly wind.
Wind patterns in the Channel have been consistent for thousands of years. Throughout August, William had been waiting to cross with nearly 700 ships. He couldn't leave without a southerly wind.
The weather in the English Channel is dominated by the Atlantic low. These are low-pressure systems which follow each other in sequence from the Atlantic across northwest Europe. The winds associated with an Atlantic low are quite characteristic. They go in an anti-clockwise direction around the centre. The significance of that for William is that he could set sail with a southwest, but would run the danger that that would be followed by a westerly and then a northwesterly, which would effectively prevent him from reaching England.
Reading the Carmen, William's problem becomes clear. 1066 was an unusually bad summer.
The Carmen of Hastings records that if suddenly the north wind diverted and held off the south, lamenting, you bedewed your face with welling tears, you were in despair. It was cold and wet, and the sky hidden by clouds and rain.
Well, it sounds like a typical description of a rotten summer, and a rotten summer is caused by depression after depression, Atlantic low after Atlantic low, sweeping across the Channel.
So William could not have been in control of when he sailed.
There are people who say that William was waiting until Harold had disbanded his forces. I don't think that is so.
In fact, in their close reading, the Grangers have unearthed an episode missing from the Bayeux tapestry. Shortly after William set sail, his fleet was shipwrecked. Men were drowned and had to be buried in secret.
Things went very wrong indeed. In modern terminology, he's tearing his hair out. He doesn't know what to do next.
Far from being in control, William was now stranded on the Normandy coast.
This is the middle of September, nearly the end of September, and it's getting to that time where no sensible person would put to sea in ancient law.
But then the unexpected happened. The weather changed, and William decided to take a gamble. Good luck, rather than good planning, got him across the Channel. And luck was still on his side when he landed. There was no one there to oppose him. Harold had an urgent appointment up north.
Suddenly, out of absolutely nowhere, came a guy called Harold Hardrada, Europe's preeminent warrior. He loved war. He loved killing people. If you want where he is in the model, he's actually beyond even there. He hated planning. Planning was not what Harold Hardrada did.
A third contender had arrived to claim the English throne, the Viking, Harold Hardrada. As a project manager, he had quite a different style.
Nowadays, he would have been armed with a mobile phone in each hand, a pager, a PDA, driving his Mondeo up the M6 at 100 miles an hour. He probably woke up one morning and said, "Let's invade England." And everyone said, "What's the plan?" He said, "I don't care, let's just do it." Harold Hardrada, there's no doubt about it.
Stephen thinks the way Harold dealt with the Vikings shows he had the better leadership skills.
Harold had done something quite incredible. He'd inspired his men to march from London to York in 4 days. And sure enough, there was Harold Hardrada having a few beers with the lads, saying what a great army they'd wiped out up north and how they wouldn't see Harold for weeks. And suddenly, over the hill came the southern English army. Hardrada could not believe it. You can imagine this army just coming over the hill and Hardrada just going, bugger. He didn't stand a chance. The Battle of Stamford Bridge was a massacre.
Stamford Bridge was an amazing victory for the Anglo-Saxons. The Vikings had arrived in 300 ships. They went back in just 24. Among those killed on the field was Hardrada himself. This surprise attack had proved that King Harold was a brilliant general, perfectly capable of seeing off invaders. But while Harold was reveling in his success, trouble was brewing down south. William had finally landed at a town called Hastings. Two weeks later, they would meet here, 7 miles inland, at a place that would forever after be known simply as Battle. So why did William choose this spot? A good general decides carefully where a battle should take place. Paul Hill believes the landscape around Battle and Hastings contains vital evidence about William's strategy. To get a sense of what the landscape was like in 1066, he has enlisted the help of a team of mapping experts. They're using the latest technology, Geographical Information Systems, or GIS, to make precise images of the area. They're able to create 3D maps, not only of the present, but also the past. Will their map of Hastings reveal the secret of William's success?
The beauty of a GIS is that you're able to bring data into one system in a way that really hasn't been easily possible before.
The first stage is to remove all traces of the present.
And what we really need to do is to peel back the layers from the modern world and get back to the landscape of 1066 and give us the opportunity of roaming around that landscape as though we were a bird flying above the scene.
To build a picture of the past, Dominic needs information from the ground itself. Beneath the surface of today's landscape is a hidden record of the last 4,000 years.
1, 2, 3.
By coring into it, Simon Jennings and Christine Smith have discovered that the coastline of Hastings was very different in 1066.
The lower part of the core down here is dominated by these solid lumps of wood, probably alder, and this represents the remains of the original woodland when this area was completely wooded. And we then get into this grey to orange mottled silty clay, and this represents an estuary. Here we have roughly the 1066 layer, and that has pollen grains typical of salt marsh. Which would include Chenopodiaceae, salt marsh grasses. We also find things called hystricopheres, which are very diagnostic of tidal conditions. Up here is about the 15th century or so, and this is the roots and the remains of the present vegetation.
Today, this area near Hastings stretches for miles inland. In 1066, it was part of the sea. When this evidence is fed into the GIS, it gives a very different picture.
So that's what it's looking like at around about the time of Hastings?
Yes, and so we can see a completely different form of shoreline. So the area that we're interested in around Battle was squeezed between areas of marsh and also by very steep-sided valleys.
The map demonstrates that in 1066, the area from Hastings to Battle was a peninsula, narrowed by difficult terrain.
Other areas now, other estuaries.
This is the first surprise for Paul. Far from William calling the shots, he appears to have been trapped.
It really does constrain William's room for manoeuvre.
There's no room for manoeuvre, is there, really? But he's also bottled up. He's only got one way out.
When Dominic adds a layer of road information from old maps, it makes it clear that William had only one option.
Do you think that the older ones are the ones along the ridgeways?
Almost certainly the older ones are along the ridgeways. They would have been much drier and easier to traverse in all weathers.
Battle is at the end of a long ridgeway coming directly from Hastings. In 1066, this would have been the major road from the south coast to London.
Whoever controls that passage into the Hastings Peninsula and, of course, that passage out of the Hastings Peninsula has won the game strategically.
The map suggests that person was not William, but Harold.
The impetus is certainly with Harold, and I think he's doing what he did at Stamford Bridge as well. He's dominating the campaign with rapid movement. This whole element of surprise seems to be key in Harold's psychology.
In 1066, much of this area of medieval England was covered by a huge forest called the Weald. When this is added, the map has a final surprise.
Oh, right. Excellent. Right, now that's quite interesting because you could have forces coming down through the Weald on these two tracks, meeting to the north of the modern town of Battle at the time.
Indeed so.
I mean, what it says to me is there's a good place to form up, to make a meeting point.
The addition of the forest forces Paul to think again. Although Battle was a good place for troops to meet up, no general would choose to fight without open space behind him.
After Harold's formed up, I think what he's probably intending to do is to carry on down this trackway towards Hastings. Although it looks like Harold is blocking the road to London, I think it's William blocking the road to Hastings that's happened.
The map has led to some unexpected insights. At first, Harold's tactics seem to have been the better. He responded quickly and almost managed to outmaneuver William. But at the last moment, it was William who surprised Harold, forcing him to fight at a place he would never have chosen.
Harold and William have had a sort of game of mind chess over a period of time, and William has won it. I think that he must have some intelligence that Harold is forming up on the hill there, and he must think, this is my golden chance, I have to have a quick decision. He probably thinks, I'm going to go north and I'm going to get him. When he wakes up in the morning, I'll be at the bottom of the ridge waiting for him.
And this is exactly where William and his army did position themselves, at the bottom of a hill, where the fate of England would be decided. As the sun rose on the morning of the 14th of October, the Anglo-Saxons formed up side by side in an impenetrable barrier known as a shield wall. All William could do was to throw the full weight of the Norman cavalry against it. The Battle of Hastings would last all day. It was one of the longest battles in medieval history. One reason it lasted so long is that the battlefield is a hill. Paul believes the lie of the land played a crucial part in how the day unfolded.
At the bottom of the slope here, William, he's got a big hill to climb. He's got to get right up onto that ridge and knock the soldiers off it. We know that he can't go round the back of the ridge because not only has Harold lined the top of the ridge with some of his best soldiers, but also just beyond the trees on either side of the ridge are two steep ravines, and you simply can't get round them.
But if Harold started with an advantage on the ground, it's always been said that William had the better army, because the Normans fought on horseback, and that made all the difference. Or did it? Horse trainer and rider Anne Hyland thinks that although horses were powerful, they were not without their problems. She thinks their role has been oversimplified by historians who don't understand how animals behave.
There's a tremendous difference in all the temperaments of horses, as much in horses as there are in humans. It's not just a man on a horse charging an enemy and the horse behaving like a machine. It just doesn't happen like that. The horse has got feelings, he has got a mind of his own.
So how much could the Norman horses be relied upon? Anne has looked at the Bayeux tapestry with a horsewoman's eye. She can pick out telling details that explain the horse's strength.
All knights rode stallions. We know they're stallions because they've got the full equipment in the requisite area under here. Stallions have a natural aggression, a hormonal aggression.
Part of the power of these horses was done to testosterone, but the tapestry shows they were also controlled by fierce equipment.
When war horses were trained, they normally wore a curb bit. They wouldn't have been very subtle about the use of it. And this part here, called a port, would rotate and hit the roof of the horse's mouth. So you've really got the horse in a vice. It would be used in a very, very savage manner, but it would have been able to stop a tank.
The great advantage of being on horseback was that weapons could be thrown with much more force. This was known as shock tactics and was made possible by the Norman saddle.
When you're casting a weapon, you can put a lot more poundage behind it if you can brace your thighs against the front of the saddle. The back stopped him being butted out of the saddle by a lance thrust from an enemy.
These details prove that although the Norman horses were powerful, they could also be unpredictable and needed strict control. And it was control that would be needed to break the Anglo-Saxon shield wall if the Normans were to win. Because the men who made up this wall were no pushover.
The Normans described the missiles that they received during the course of these charges as being somewhat unusual. Here's a mace in the middle of the sky here, just been thrown out of the enemy lines. There's an axe, maybe that's about to be thrown. Here are the javelins locked in place behind the shields of these two well-armed warriors here. They're about to throw them.
Behind the wall, the Anglo-Saxons were armed not only with missiles, but also with battle axes. These have been written off as primitive weapons, no match for the modern fighting style of the Normans. But Pete Seymour has spent years making and wielding battle axes, and he appreciates what can be done with them.
The best move for any axeman is a crushing blow, slash at close quarters. You could parry the butt of the weapon, which is very useful. It's a very dexterous weapon.
The axe is simple to make, but by understanding its design, Pete thinks you can appreciate its versatility.
It has a long cutting edge, quite often over 12 inches, which could make a very nasty injury, if not instant death, with very little effort. Any old bog iron could be smelted down and used for the body of the axe. This was compensated for by having an edge heat welded on of high carbon steel, which could be sharpened and would keep its edge for a long time. And if you got in a tight corner, or maybe even if the head got cut off by a sword, you had the butt end, like a quarterstaff, that could do terrible damage to someone's face or groin.
By the end of the morning, the Battle of Hastings had reached stalemate. Neither the axemen nor the cavalry had gained the advantage. One reason historians have given for the Norman weakness is that the performance of their horses was affected by the slope of the hill.
The hill is going to sort the stronger from the weaker animals. There are going to be disparities in their speeds.
Anne thinks the real problem was not speed, but the lack of coordination in the Norman cavalry.
To deliver the shock tactic, the animals have got to stay together. You're going to have some horses that are going to chicken out, are going to try and turn. So I doubt very much that they got to the shield wall in one nice line.
Unfortunately for Harold, the terrain stopped his men taking advantage of this Norman weakness.
This ridge is really quite a narrow one. It's only 600 or 700 yards long, and he's bringing up to 10,000 men, and they're getting more and more tightly packed on this ridge. The Bayeux tapestry shows close order formation with shields overlapping, just as many of the historical accounts of the day had said. In fact, some of them are supposed to have died standing up. It was so constricted.
So in fact, the lie of the land affected the Anglo-Saxons more than the Normans. And those who were most constricted were Harold's crack troops, the axemen.
These were the royal bodyguard in the Anglo-Saxon ranks. Of course, they found themselves at great disadvantage, trying to wield a weapon that is primarily a slashing and whirling tool when they were cramped in the Anglo-Saxon lines. The men armed in this way could hardly have been at their most effective, shoulder to shoulder, on a very steep piece of terrain.
As the fighting continued into the afternoon, both generals needed a way to break the deadlock. It seems to be William that found one. Something made the Anglo-Saxons leave their shield wall.
Most of the chronicles agree that what happened at one point in the battle is that the Saxons were teased off the ridge, apparently yelling as they went. And it's here that the central Norman command turned and wheeled on these flying Saxons.
It seems the Anglo-Saxons thought victory was in their grasp. They were wrong. The Normans cut them to pieces. Was this a clever trick by William? Accounts say that he had made his horses charge the Anglo-Saxons, but then pretend to run away, teasing them off the ridge. But were the Norman cavalry capable of such a tactic?
There's only two ways that animals can extricate themselves from a charge en masse. And one is by veering the same way, otherwise they'd be bumping into each other, or else they could have performed a rollback. All that is a horse going fast one way, turning within its own length on its hocks and coming back the other way without losing any appreciable speed. The same manoeuvre had been used in warfare for many hundreds of years.
William's use of this tactic seems to be proof that he was a more cunning general. But the fact that it worked doesn't necessarily mean it was cleverly planned.
Horses are herd animals. They will go where the leader goes. When the Normans fled, Some horses would have turned and it would have had a knock-on effect. Herd animals.
Many Anglo-Saxon lives were lost in this incident, but that was probably down to William's good luck as much as his skill. And the battle was still not over. The outcome would actually depend on a single death. There was one thing above all others that mattered on the medieval battlefield: the fate of the leader. Once the leader fell, the battle was deemed to be over. During the long battle at Hastings, William was in danger far more often than Harold. He had 3 horses killed underneath him, and at one point was thought to be dead. If he had been, the course of history would have been entirely different.
Here he's lifted his visor. This is the Duke himself. He's lifted his visor and he's pointing at his face. He's probably shouting a lot as well. And next to him is the standard bearer, and he's saying, "This is William. He's still alive. So come on, steady yourself."
The moment passed, and it was not William who would be the first to die. The evidence now suggests that the leaders and the armies were equally matched. Dusk approached, and all Harold had to do was hold on until the darkness made it impossible to continue. So what eventually did tip the balance? The final clue is staring Paul in the face.
The legend is that the high altar of the Abbey Church marks the site of the death of Harold. And that says to me that the landscape has dictated where the crucial blows finally fell.
Harold's death spot should be in the center of the ridge. That's where he would normally have fought, at the heart of his troops. But the altar of Battle Abbey is over to the right side of the ridge. This was where Harold found himself at the end of the day, fighting in his front ranks. It was the landscape that proved his downfall. The hill was not as steep on this side, and as dusk fell, the Normans found this weak spot.
It makes military sense that the final decision should have happened up there. Harold has to move over with his personal bodyguard and his standards, perhaps 200 or 300 men, because he's spotted a real calamity. Before that side of his army fell to pieces, it's hard to say who was going to win the day. He's having to shore it up, and that's where he dies.
Harold dying with an arrow in his eye is the most famous scene on the Bayeux tapestry. And it makes military sense that this really is the spot where it happened. So the altar of Battle Abbey is the one clue on a battlefield that has never yielded archaeological evidence. But what about the arrow in Harold's eye?
I do not think that Harold was killed by an arrow to the eye. I think that is an invention of the Bayeux tapestry.
If there's one thing everyone knows about the Battle of Hastings, it's that Harold died from an arrow in the eye. But is that really what happened? David Bernstein is one of the few people ever to have examined the Bayeux tapestry close up. He thinks the scene of Harold's death raises an interesting question.
This has been one of the most controversial scenes because it's unclear which of the figures is actually the king, the one whose head is framed by the name Harold, or the one who is more clearly down and out, who falls under the words "is killed." Actually, there was a convention in medieval art to show a person twice in one episode.
It's possible that both figures could be the dying Harold, especially when you take a closer look at the figure on the right.
When you look more closely at the brow of that figure, you see something very interesting. There are small holes which extend the line beyond the handle of the axe. This suggested by the spacing, the size of the holes, and the discoloration around it, that in fact there had at one time been stitchery there of an arrow.
So both characters are probably Harold. And this one is also being chopped in the thigh. This fits with the gory description of Harold's death in an account written in 1068, earlier than the tapestry itself, an account called the Carmen, or Song of the Battle of Hastings.
The first, cleaving his breast through the shield with his point, drenched the earth with a gushing torrent of blood. The second smote off his head below the protection of the helmet, and the third pierced the innards of his belly with his lance. The fourth hewed off his thigh and bore away the severed limb. The ground held the body thus destroyed.
But the Carmen is also interesting for what it doesn't say.
Nothing is said about an arrow to the eye.
If Harold was not hit in the eye, why would the Bayeux tapestry show it? David has an explanation.
In medieval art and lore, blinding was often interpreted as a punishment by God for a particular sin. I think that the creators of the Bayeux tapestry invented the motif of blinding as a way of showing punishment for a particular crime that Harold had committed.
The blinding of Harold needs to be read as part of the whole story told by the tapestry, rather than as a true representation of what happened at the battle.
I think that the Bayeux tapestry was created as a two-act drama, and at the end of Act 1, Harold swore an oath to William that he would further William's claims to the throne of England. Then, at this scene, which shows the death of the king, the artist had the problem of showing how did that oath-breaking affect his outcome, and that blinding was a metaphor to show his punishment by God.
Whatever the weapon that killed him, Harold did die. By medieval convention, on his death, the majority of the Anglo-Saxons gave up the fight, and William took victory. Harold's closest elite troops died with him on the hill.
This was wonderful for William because the whole of the board of directors of England Incorporated was killed at Hastings. So as a hostile takeover, you get the company and actually you kill every main board director. That was William's idea of a good outcome. Finally, we have the winner, William. He's made it to be king instead of just Duke of Normandy. It's the thing that had driven this man since his childhood. He wanted to be legitimate, and now he was a legitimate king. No longer to be known as William the Bastard, he was going to be known as William the Conqueror.
William didn't win the Battle of Hastings because he was a better general. Harold and William were well matched as opponents. Both had good luck and bad. But on the day of the battle itself, victory for the Normans came down to the simple fact that Harold was killed first. William was victorious, and the future of England was changed forever. Spain was the superpower of the age. Under its king, Philip II, it had grown rich on religious crusades, imposing the Catholic faith on South America and plundering gold in return. Elizabeth I had long been a thorn in Philip's side, her country a rogue state, Protestant, poor, and piratical. Elizabeth encouraged adventurers like Francis Drake to attack Spanish treasure fleets and cut her in on the proceeds. It was a dangerous game.
Elizabeth had spent 20 years provoking Spain on and off. At one moment she was a superb appeaser, the next moment she was belligerent. She was steering the ship of state through the most dangerous waters this country has probably ever seen.
And Elizabeth's politicking was about to hit the rocks with the execution of the Catholic Mary, Queen of Scots. In his palace outside Madrid, Philip had long prepared an invasion plan. It was ambitious, deploying two separate armies. The Armada would escort the first from Spain to the English Channel. There they would combine with troops from the Spanish Netherlands. Together, they would land in Kent and march on London. Elizabeth knew of Philip's plans, but could offer little resistance. While he had two regular armies, she had none. Her part-time militiamen were no match for Spanish professionals. England's only defense was the sea and the ships of the Royal Navy. But how good were they? History tells us that ship design changed radically under Elizabeth. Now, using computer modeling, John Adams, an archaeologist, can see just how far-reaching those changes were.
The ships of the Armada campaign represents almost a revolution. The way ships are conceived, designed, constructed and used has completely been rethought. And the benefits of that rethink, effectively, are manifested in the ships that fight the Armada.
It's clear that the English warship had been completely reinvented. From the bottom up, they were more streamlined, what a new generation of ship designers called race-built.
Race-built refers to the profile that these ships presented. If you looked at them side by side, one is a great big bulky, much higher, taller structure, whereas the race-built galleon has a much sleeker, lower hull. The performance analysis that we've carried out indicates that ships of the Armada campaign would have been considerably faster. We also see the rig, the thing that powers the ship along, that is also changed as well. So it transmits more power per square foot. This allows the ship to be used in ways that are much more inventive.
But against the might of the Armada, would these technological advances prove enough? Elizabeth's Royal Navy was about to be put to the test. As the Armada entered the Channel on July the 29th, 1588, the English saw for the first time the scale of Philip's invasion force. The chains of beacons had been long prepared.
The beacons were a traditional system of giving warning of seaborne attack. The mechanisms were very well organized. Districts or parishes were responsible for maintaining their beacons, keeping permanent watchmen and so on. And it was a very effective system. It would work in most circumstances.
England was crisscrossed by a complex network of vantage points relaying signals by line of sight. They could communicate only one simple, prearranged message, but they did so with surprising speed.
I've seen a calculation based on modern experience with lighting beacons that the message could probably have got from Plymouth to Carlisle, i.e. the northernmost frontier of England, in about 40 minutes.
As the beacons flared, there was trepidation among the English in Plymouth. What would the Spanish do?
All they were confronted with was this enormous fleet. Nothing like it had been seen in the Channel since Roman times. So finally, the great forces of the Antichrist, as they would look at it, had arrived in the Channel in strength.
But the Channel is a capricious stretch of water, and in the age of sail, both sides were at the mercy of the elements. Every twist and turn in the battle to come would depend on the vagaries of weather, tide, and current. 4 centuries later, is it possible to pinpoint the weather faced by the Armada? On the coast of Northern Ireland, where many Spanish ended up, Ken Douglas, a self-taught meteorologist, believes that it is.
The weather certainly was the key. There wasn't any secret about that, but nobody had actually tried to put it together in modern meteorological terms.
Ken Douglas has used the ship's logs from the Spanish and English fleets to piece together a picture of the daily weather observations for 1588.
I could see from that there was information there giving us wind speeds, whether it was raining, etc., wind directions, and it seemed logical just to put those on a map and see if it was possible to turn those into some kind of synoptic charts.
A synoptic chart is a standard weather map showing high and low pressure areas in the atmosphere. In areas of high pressure, the winds rotate clockwise. In low pressure areas, anti-clockwise. Knowing the ship's positions and their recorded wind directions, Ken could calculate the weather throughout the entire campaign. Now, for the first time, this data can be combined with computer images to create a daily weather map for the Armada.
From the period after they entered the Channel, the luck seemed to favour the Spaniards. A high-pressure cell developed to the northwest, and in high pressure the winds circulate clockwise, so that the wind would be from the west. It also produces good weather, and it stayed with them the rest of the week.
Everything favoured the Spanish. They were in open sea with the wind behind them. At anchor in Plymouth, the English were a sitting target. Yet when Sir Francis Drake was warned of the threat, he is said famously to have shown more concern for his afternoon sport than for the approaching Spanish.
This was a dramatic moment. This was the Spanish fleet of 130-odd ships found in the western approaches just off the Lizard. Drake's response is one of cool, calculated, phlegmatic dismissal, that there is plenty of time to deal with this enemy and finish the game of bowls. Whether it's absolutely correct, we don't know, but it works. It's a piece of theatre and it's gone into the Armada legend.
But why did Drake do nothing? Looking at the tide patterns for that July day, Steve Hall, an oceanographer, reckons he simply had no choice.
It's possible to predict quite accurately what the state of the tide and the current flow would be. And we can see that if Drake had been wanting to finish his game of bowls, there wasn't really anything he could do until 8:30, 9 o'clock in the evening anyway, because of the state of the tide. There was no way of getting those ships into the English Channel.
The English lay helpless, but the Spanish made no attempt to strike. Their commander, the Duke of Medina Sidonia, had orders to keep strictly to Philip's battle plan.
18,000 Spaniards ashore in Plymouth would have been quite a headache for us. Fortunately, the Spanish orders were so inflexible that this golden opportunity that the Duke of Medina Sidonia might have taken advantage of was missed there for Spain.
An opportunity which the English seized as the tide turned. Upwind, the Spanish were still confident, but they were about to be confounded by the quickness of the English warships.
Because the English ships were capable of sailing much closer to the wind than the Spanish thought, to their horror, the Spanish found the English ships working their way behind them, ahead of them, around their fleet, and getting into tactically advantageous positions that they hadn't anticipated at all.
The Spanish ships couldn't compete. They were solidly built, but lacked the nimbleness of the English.
We have two images here. One is generically English type of galleon, and another is a reconstruction of the San Diego, a Spanish galleon. Just in looking at the two profiles, you can see that the English hull form is slightly more compact. The castle structure is a little bit lower. The Spanish galleon has a much longer forward raking stem, a shorter keel by comparison, and a much more angular rake in the sternpost. And perhaps some of the differences that we see are part of the reason why the performance of the English ships in 1588 so surprised the Spanish.
The English had used the maneuverability of their ships to seize the advantage of wind and weather from the Spanish. Now they could dictate tactics.
The important thing about gaining the weather gauge, or getting upwind of the enemy, is it gives you total flexibility of maneuver. You can either attack or pull away as you will. Those who are downwind really have to react to what you're doing. They're not in a position to really do much about it. You can drop down from upwind on them. It's very hard for them to claw their way back up to get at you.
It was the Spanish who were vulnerable now, but they responded quickly. They switched into the defensive crescent formation used by their treasure fleets.
The Spaniards were very experienced at organizing defensive convoys. They'd been doing it for a long time. And it was a good formation. The English could really only attack the trailing wings where the main Spanish warships were stationed. They couldn't safely penetrate into the gap between because it would have been too easy for them to be trapped by the Spanish ships.
The Spanish expected that any fighting would be at close quarters. That was how sea battles had always been fought. But the English had a new kind of warfare in mind. They intended to sink the Spanish at long range.
What was new was that the English were carrying into action much heavier gun batteries than anybody had done before. And the Spaniards were well aware of this, and they were intensely concerned that they were going to find themselves facing a weight of gunfire which they couldn't possibly match.
And this was the weapon the Spanish feared most, the long-barreled cannon known as the culverin, or snake. To the English, it was a ship killer, but would it prove the decisive factor in sinking the Spanish?
Culverins are characterized by having these long, slender barrels in relation to their caliber. The caliber of this gun's about 5.5 inches. The reason for this long proportion is probably because they believed that you get the maximum benefit from the burning powder charge in the long barrel, and it would probably fire quite accurately as well. But it's a high velocity weapon. I mean, we're getting a very fast moving cannonball going more or less straight where you aim it.
For the Elizabethans, it was a super weapon. But how deadly was the culverin? Nick Hall is about to put this replica to the test on a modern firing range. '16th century gunnery was a black art with few scientific principles. Gunners worked by trial and error, and their knowledge of ballistics was limited. But on paper, the culverin appeared formidable, with a range of over 600 yards at 0 elevation.
Okay, distance is 307 meters over.
Nick Hall and his colleagues are examining these claims using 21st century tools, high-speed cameras and Doppler radar.
Undercover!
Gun ready.
Stand by. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, fire.
The culverin's opening shot is well over 1/4 mile, already close to the performance claimed by the Elizabethan gunners.
Did you get that muzzle velocity?
No.
408 meters per second, and the distance for the long-range warm-up shot was 477.8 meters. So 477.8 meters. I mean, that's good. So that's almost horizontal, isn't it? And that's nearly the range that Born in 1587 is saying with 666 yards.
Yeah.
What those early gunners could not have dreamed of measuring was the speed of the cannonball leaving the muzzle. At over 400 meters a second, the 24-pound iron shot is traveling at above the speed of sound. The culverin, then, has a powerful reach, but how accurate is it? We know that the Spanish feared above all the sharpshooting of the English gunners.
Philip II briefed his commanders that the English would try to shoot low. They would try to damage the Spanish hulls, ideally just below the waterline.
So what do you think we are? We're slightly left?
Well, I thought...
Slightly right.
We're slightly
right,
but
aren't we?
It's time to try the culverin against a target, just 10 feet square, but the thickness of a ship's hull. The target is 150 meters away, the gun barrel dead level.
3, 2, 1, fire!
But the cannonball flies high.
On the negative side, we missed the target by an appreciable amount, but we would have had a very good hit on the ship.
It was well within the bounds of the ship, wasn't it?
Yes.
Striped markers indicate the overall length of the imaginary ship, but only a direct hit on the woodwork will produce real damage. Wooden galleons were surprisingly hardy, as the Elizabethan gunners soon found. It was one thing to hit the enemy, but to sink them needed repeated shots on target. Accurate and consistent fire at a time when most sailors had no knowledge of maths or science. Our present-day gunners have different problems. 21st century know-how ought to give them an edge, but their mental arithmetic seems to confuse even them.
We reckon it was about 6 foot higher, so we want to come down about 12 feet, don't we?
Well, that's
4
not
meters.
30
4
centimeters,
meters.
is it?
4 meters want to come down?
Yeah. And what's that in mils?
4 meters in mils.
4,000.
That range.
A mil subtends a meter at 1,000, so at 100 it subtends 0.1 of a mil.
I'm sure you're right.
The logic is clear enough. If the shot is flying too high, the gun must be lowered. But the muzzle's already below horizontal.
About there?
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, fire!
Amazingly, even with the gun pointing down, the shot is still going skywards. The experts agree to aim lower still.
The shot went straight over the top of the target, and I saw it impact in the ground at about 1,000 meters. So it's gone well over the top of the target. So we actually need to lower the elevation quite considerably, I think.
But in reality, how much more would you depress a gun?
We probably want to come down almost 100 mils, so we're looking at bringing it down about 4 or 5 degrees.
But the radar will tell you whether it's hit.
Respect is rising for the English gunners of 400 years ago. It's hard enough to aim the culverin on dry land, let alone on a pitching warship in full sail.
Well, is this it?
That's it, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, that's perfectly in line. Look at it.
And suddenly recognition dawns. The reason that the shot is flying high is staring them in the face. A telltale track where it's ricocheted off the ground.
Why don't we split the difference?
Well, maybe we just leave it where it is.
We're sure this happened from this firing and not one of the earlier ones.
Yeah, because we haven't seen this
one yet.
What did the radar?
Belatedly, the 21st century gunners realize they've been aiming too low all along. It's time to beat the retreat.
So what we've done now is effectively raised the gun by 40 minutes. So 40 minutes is about 10 mils. So therefore, theoretically, we should raise it 1.5 meters on the target. That would be 10 meters a kilometer. So that would be 1 meter.
They're averaging just 1 cannon shot an hour, with as yet no hits. The Elizabethan gunners managed exactly the same rate of fire, But even after 6 days at sea, they too had made little impression on the enemy. And such heavy long-range shooting had used precious powder and shot.
Of course, one of the big questions is why the English fleet, or the Royal Navy, was so relatively ineffective. It had the advantage of the weather gauge, it had the advantage of the fast manoeuvrable ships, it had the advantage of heavy artillery, yet had to break off the attack because it was using up too much ammunition, and it had had very little to show for itself.
It was round one to the Spanish, and with English hopes crumbling, the way was now open for the Armada to follow through with its long-planned invasion. In Flanders, the soldiers of the Duke of Parma were waiting. These were the crack troops that would lead the Spanish invasion of England. All that was needed was the ships to get them there. Out in the Channel, the Armada had left their English pursuers trailing. But a crucial flaw now appeared in the Spanish invasion plans. Their commander, Medina Sidonia, discovered there was no port large enough for him to take Parma's army on board.
Medina Sidonia was clearly extremely worried about what the outcome would be, because he didn't really see how this vital link-up with the Duke of Parma was actually going to take place. He began to realize that total disaster was in the offing.
For 6 days, the Spaniards had run the gauntlet of English firepower in the Channel. Now they had no choice but to heave to in open sea. They were at anchor and vulnerable, and the weather was turning.
The Armada's luck was beginning to run out. They had had a good time coming up the Channel as far as wind was concerned, but as the day progressed, they came under the influence of low pressure to the northeast, and that produced northwest winds which got stronger all the time.
And it's now clear that it wasn't just the weather that was beginning to conspire against the Spanish.
It's a full moon, we're going to have some very strong tides with strong tidal flows, and the Spanish wouldn't really be able to get out, certainly not in formation. We're coming up to the evening, we see it gets to 8:30, 9 o'clock, the tide changes. Strong tides, about 3 knots. And so these ships would have been pinned against the coast at the mercy of the wind and the tide and the English.
The English had a plan. A handful of ships would be sacrificed. Soaked in pitch and set ablaze, they would become weapons of terror, carried on the rising tide deep into the Spanish fleet. With their defensive shape broken, the scattered Spanish troopships made easy targets. For the first time, the English could now close on the enemy.
This is the point at which the English started firing at very close range. And this is the point, it's clear, when Spanish ships are beginning to suffer serious damage and heavy casualties.
At long range, the English guns had been ineffective. Now, at close quarters, they proved fearsome.
We are beginning to see, I think, enormous damage being inflicted on the Spanish ships. Their decks have been raked by round shot. Swathes of splinters are scything through men. Anything with soft tissue is being cut down and severely damaged. Rigging, structures of the boat are being smashed. The Spanish actually are taking a terrible pounding at this stage, and the hammering is getting worse, getting more and more intense.
Yet while the English were out shooting the Spaniards, they still had difficulty sinking them. Medina Sidonia's flagship was hit 200 times but kept sailing, and the English powder and shot were almost spent.
They were firing, in comparison with the Spaniards, much more quickly, much more effectively, and causing real damage to the Spanish ships. But it was relatively limited. They just didn't have the ammunition stocks to keep up the continuous attrition which is necessary to physically disable or sink a wooden ship.
Quite frankly, there was not enough firepower going down to stop the Armada. We could not put enough weight of fire into various vessels to slow them down. Otherwise, we would have expected far higher casualty rate.
go to slightly more elevation, it's not a problem.
7 degrees?
Even at close range, it seems, the English still had a problem achieving the consistent and accurate fire that they needed. So can our present-day gunners do any better? Just as their predecessors closed on the Armada, they too are hauling in their target to just 50 meters. Drake would have approved.
Fire! 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 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, fire! Oh, I heard something.
What happened?
I saw the ball, or what I thought actually was a bit of the target flying off.
Oh, God, that's impossible.
War is hell, but this is worse. Firing at a fixed target at point-blank range, a fusillade of gunfire has brought just one tantalizing, possible strike.
I wonder whether it just kissed the top, which would give you a sound. Look. I'm right.
What?
Look.
It's either the narrowest of misses or a glancing hit. Nick knows which theory he favours.
And it gave a dong, didn't it?
It was definitely a dong.
I'm not just clutching at straws, but I'm convinced the sound was right.
Yeah.
And I think that that bright piece of metal there on the front of that, well, the edge of that flange, and the bit of muck on that flange.
Then it went off to the right, didn't it?
I was going, that I was going to see a hole in the target because I just saw the ball. Most of the target was hidden by smoke, and I thought then, as the smoke cleared, I'd see a hole. And obviously we didn't. Just a question.
Oh, do you want me to...
No, I'm not going to fall.
There's only one way to prove it. Time to inspect the evidence close up.
But I get down against nothing.
No, and then what is it? 'Cause it looks like it's from you.
I thought that was some nice gunpowder fouling. That is from the forklift.
Right. Grease from the forks. Mark.
I think I might have to retract.
How are you going to get down now?
I don't know.
400 years ago, the Elizabethan gunners were also left high and dry. They had put their faith in heavy guns like the culverin, but that hadn't been enough.
Every generation has its new super weapon. They all think it's going to work wonderfully. They've all done trials. But when it comes to the real war, somehow things are different. Well, it was the same with their new heavy guns. It didn't work as well as they thought it was going to, and they were a long way from having worked out the most effective ways to use smooth-bore, muzzle-loading guns.
The Spanish were battered but unbroken. The English in good order but desperate for ammunition. No glorious victory, just a standoff.
It was essentially a draw. Neither had achieved what it wanted to achieve. The Spaniards hadn't landed in England, but equally, the English hadn't defeated the Spaniards. The Armada was still in good order, its discipline, formation was intact, and it was still a very formidable force. The Duke of Medina Sidonia was in charge.
And Medina Sidonia was still determined to carry out the invasion plan. What settled matters was not the English, but the weather. An onshore wind now threatened imminently to break the Armada against the Dutch coast. But just when catastrophe seemed certain, the wind reversed direction and blew them back out to sea. To the Spanish, there was only one explanation: divine intervention.
The Spanish thought this change of wind was a miracle, but we can now see that a high-pressure cell had developed and come in just at exactly the right moment for them. Produced southwest wind, and that enabled them to escape into the North Sea.
But once in the North Sea, and with the wind behind them, there could be no going back for the Armada. Their invasion plans were put on hold. Now Medina Sidonia's priority was to get his Armada safely home to Spain, and there was only one way to do it: the long way round. This is the route that he set for his fleet, taking them north of Scotland and far out into the Atlantic before heading south and homewards. He was well aware of the dangers.
They were to make as much seaway into the Atlantic as they could so that they get a safe run southward to Spain. Because the great danger was to be caught by the prevailing westerly winds and dashed on the wild Atlantic coasts of Scotland and Ireland. And he took particular care to say, take great heed lest you fall upon the island of Ireland, for fear of the harm that might happen to you upon that coast.
Orders from Medina Sidonia were not to be taken lightly. He was a disciplinarian who had already executed one Armada captain for breaking formation. But despite his orders to stay clear of Ireland, within weeks, 3,000 of his men would end up dead on its shores. No one has ever questioned how that came to be. But now we can reveal new evidence that the Spanish were victims of a natural phenomenon, one which made it impossible to follow their commander's orders. Blooded but unbeaten, the Spanish Armada was heading homewards, forced by the weather to take the long northern passage out into the Atlantic. Medina Sidonia had given particular orders to stay clear of Ireland's dangerous coast. So how did a third of his fleet end up shipwrecked there? To search for clues, Ken Douglas has gone back to the ship's logs of the Armada. They reveal the disquiet of one man in particular, a senior officer called Marcos de Aramburu. Aramburu was an experienced and professional seafarer, and he left a detailed account of how, despite all his efforts to steer out into the Atlantic, he still ended up on the Irish coast.
This is Medina Sidonia's sailing instructions as we've seen. Marcos de Aramburu kept a careful log of his positions, and on certain dates he estimated how far west he had got. And on the 9th of September, he was at 54 degrees north. He estimated he was 360 miles west of Ireland. But on the 11th of September, after just 2 days sailing, he was on the Irish coast. It would have been impossible for him to sail that distance in 2 days. The implication's obvious. He was never as far west as he thought he was, so he could never have been out there.
So how had Aramburu ended up on the coast? Working back painstakingly from his landfall, Ken Douglas discovered that he had in fact been steering an erratic course 300 miles further east than he thought. He records soundings on the seabed which would have been impossible in the deep ocean. It's a colossal error of navigation. What could have brought the Spanish to make it?
The missing factor, in my view, is the North Atlantic Drift, the Gulf Stream. They didn't know it existed. They were navigating by dead reckoning, so that as they thought they were making headway westwards, they were in fact losing about 25 miles a day by not knowing to deduct the allowance for the North Atlantic Drift.
The Gulf Stream is one of the world's most powerful currents. Rising in the Gulf of Mexico, at its peak it's 5 times stronger than all the world's rivers combined. Even after reaching the British Isles, its energy remains formidable and, to the unwary, unpredictable.
I don't think that the Spanish would have had any concept that this current continued anything like as far north as it does. They might have been familiar with parts of this current further across the Atlantic from their voyages between Spain and the Americas, but it's most unlikely that they would have had any knowledge that this current carried this far north or retained this much strength at these latitudes.
How might the Gulf Stream have affected the Armada? For 10 full days in late August, bad weather blocked any progress southwards. Instead, as Aramburu's record shows, the Spanish tried to head out into the Atlantic. But with the Gulf Stream against them, any impression that they were making headway could well have been an illusion. When the wind finally turned on September the 3rd, they clearly felt confident that they could steer safely home to Spain. But if in fact they were further east, that fatal turn would bring them directly onto the coasts they had been trying to avoid. Ken's theory is new. No Armada history has ever questioned the Spaniards' navigation. But how plausible is it? The only way to find out is to put it to the test. Roger Proctor is an expert on ocean currents.
So we have to think about how fast the ship can actually sail into a current like this, with the fact also that there is wind and wave activity.
His computer model is more often used for tracking oil spills or drifting mines than 16th century warships.
And whether or not the ship can actually sail into that kind of...
And it would be losing ground.
And it would be losing ground. So
Good.
It could actually be going backwards instead of going forwards, as it thought it was.
Yes.
But by combining the observations of Aramburu with what we now know of weather and sea conditions, it may be possible to recreate the Armada's true course in September 1588.
Well, we've pretty well factored in most of these things now. So we have some idea of the currents due to the winds.
Yeah.
We have some idea of the winds themselves, the wind's directions, and we have some idea that the ship was sailing at the time.
It's not straightforward. In these northern waters, the Gulf Stream is constricted and flows at only half a knot. Wind speed and ocean depths also affected.
You know, with a 20-knot wind, if that could add an extra 0.4 of a knot to the current against the ship.
Yeah, I mean, one of the factors we have to be thoughtful about is the North Atlantic current is actually quite a narrow feature, so the positioning here is quite critical.
The first run-through isn't promising. It seems that Aramburu could have cleared Ireland easily.
The wind turns around and enables him to sail at a good speed down across the Rockall Bank, then misses Ireland completely. This assumes that the ship is actually fairly efficient in its sailing.
But this track is based on a first-rate sailing ship handling well. To reproduce the performance of the Spanish vessels, they will need to adjust the profile of the computer model.
Yeah, safely.
That's right.
So there could well be other ships coming in, drifted east, and they would be the ones that come down on the Irish coast.
They could be,
yeah.
As we know, the Spanish ships did not sail well against the wind.
So it's really down to the efficiency that the ship can sail when it's trying to batter through its way through stormy conditions, really.
Many ships also had structural damage, and their crews were exhausted.
By the time these guys got this far west, they'd have been pretty much starving in a pretty sorry state, weren't they?
Yes.
Their efficiency would have dropped off a lot.
Yes,
that's right.
To reproduce the likely sailing qualities of Aramburu's ship, Roger makes one final adjustment. Then, 400 years on, the Spanish once again struggle against the Gulf Stream as they head for home.
In this calculation here, then, we're really assuming the captain is having difficulty sailing into the wind at all. He can't make it. So, I mean, normally...
She used to be heading for Ireland.
Well, it's heading due south at the moment. In the 20th before that. So it's quite surprising.
That's not far away. Yeah, I could agree with that.
The effect of the current is slight but insidious, and over a period of time, deadly. In the grip of the Gulf Stream, Aramburu turns, as he thinks, for Spain. And despite a desperate struggle to avoid it, he is thrown onto a hostile shore.
Just brings it alive. I'm trying to work it out in my imagination, and there it is in real life. Well, you have to feel sorry for the crews who had already experienced a tremendous amount of privation. They had suffered battle damage and they'd suffered heavy weather damage. And here they were out in seas, as they said themselves, almost unknown to them. And the fact is they didn't know where they were. They must have felt completely lost.
In a matter of days, some 40 Spanish ships appeared on the coasts of Scotland and Ireland. And once on the shoreline they had tried so hard to avoid, many found it impossible to get off again. They were pounded to pieces by storms. To this day, no one knows how many were lost, but almost half the ships that had sailed from Spain so proudly never returned. God blew, and they were scattered, reads the medal commemorating England's deliverance. Elizabeth, like Philip, put her faith in God, not men. But the Armada was not sunk by the weather alone, and certainly not by English gunfire. Those who died were victims of a colossal error of navigation, and of a natural phenomenon whose existence they never even suspected. It's 7:30 on the evening of June the 18th, 1815. These are the final moments of the Battle of Waterloo, one of the most decisive military encounters in history. After hours of heavy fighting, Napoleon sends forward the Imperial Guard in one last desperate bid to defeat the Allied army under the Duke of Wellington.
Napoleon hadn't really been defeated in a great cataclysmic battle. There was a sense that somehow he'd been cheated, that somehow he was still the master of the battlefield. Waterloo ends that myth.
Waterloo has always been seen as a tactical victory for the Duke of Wellington. His small but highly trained Allied army outfighting the veteran soldiers of Napoleon's Grande Armée. But was there more to Napoleon's defeat than the tactics and fighting prowess of the Allies? Now the latest scientific techniques are shedding crucial light on Napoleon's campaign. And a dramatic archaeological discovery is helping answer the central question: what went wrong for Napoleon at Waterloo? In 1815, Europe had been at war for more than 20 years. Out of the chaos of the French Revolution, Napoleon Bonaparte had forged an empire on the battlefields of Europe. Victory had followed victory, and Napoleon seemed unstoppable. But by 1815, time and war had taken their toll, and the great powers of Europe had finally united to rid themselves of Napoleon once and for all. As the massed armies of Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia closed in, Napoleon launched a desperate preemptive strike.
For Napoleon, the clock really is ticking. He desperately needs peace. He can't get it. And what he's got to do is he's got to defeat the Prussians and the British, but particularly the British, before the huge mass armies of the Russians and the Austrians descend upon him. Because once they descend upon Paris, Napoleon's had it.
On the night of the 17th of June, 1815, the Duke of Wellington prepared his troops to face Napoleon's Grande Armée. Taking up position at Waterloo on the southern outskirts of Brussels, the 90,000 British and Allied soldiers awaited the attack of Napoleon's 120,000-strong French army. Heavily outnumbered, the Allies' only hope was to link up with Blücher's Prussian army. But as day dawned on the 18th, the Prussians were still several hours' march from Waterloo. If Napoleon could move swiftly, the odds would be stacked in his favor. But the longer he delayed, the greater the chance of the Prussians coming to the Allies' aid. For Napoleon, the clock was ticking. The battlefield today seems miraculously unaffected amidst the suburban sprawl of Brussels. In the tense days building up to the battle, Wellington would have surveyed this scene and identified the ideal defensive position to stop Napoleon.
Throughout the period that Wellington is in Flanders, he is constantly thinking, if Napoleon comes, where will he come? Which routes will he adopt? Where, therefore, can I stop him?
Wellington had an expert eye for terrain. He drew up his army along the crest of a ridge where the main Brussels road crossed the Waterloo Valley. But today, it's difficult to tell precisely how good Wellington's position was, because contrary to appearances, the landscape has changed. It's now dominated by a giant artificial hill called the Lion Mound. Thousands of tons of soil were scraped away to create this 40-meter-high mound, a huge earth monument to the Dutch and Belgian troops who died at Waterloo. Wellington was furious at how the construction of the mound destroyed his battlefield.
Wellington went back to the battlefield of Waterloo and he saw that mound. And he said to one of his companions, Colonel Gurwood, he said, "Damn me, Gurwood, they've ruined it. Them Hollanders have ruined my battlefield." Or words to that effect. He was furious.
But why was Wellington so incensed? What was it about his Waterloo position that construction of the Lion Mound destroyed? What made the position so effective was the ridge. With his troops lined along its crest, Wellington knew that the forward slope provided a clear field of fire and a steep natural obstacle against attack, whereas the reverse slope sheltered his troops from incoming fire. So how much did the removal of topsoil for the Lion Mound change this distinctive ridge? Landscape archaeologist Paul Hill suspects the ridge is now much lower than it would have been in 1815. Contemporary prints of the area prior to the mound's construction provide Paul with valuable clues as to what has changed. Roads are usually depicted as having steep embankments on either side. But to the east of the Lion Mound, the Ohain Road now has an embankment on only one side.
It's very clear that there's been a major change in the land formation here. I'm standing on top of a large bank on the north side of the main Ohain Road, the east-west road. If we look further to the south on the other side of the road, you can see there isn't a bank at all, and there should be one there at least as high as this one. If we can recreate this landscape and see the level of the slope up which cavalry and infantry have to run, we can see why Wellington chose such a position to defend.
But to prove his theory, Paul must somehow create a view of the landscape as it appeared to Wellington on the day of the battle. Specialist help is required. He calls in surveyors James Kavanagh and Dan Schnurr. Using a revolutionary new survey technique, the team will create a terrain-accurate 3D computer model of the battlefield. The result should be a unique impression of how the Waterloo landscape appeared to Wellington in 1815.
Okay, this gives us a nice clear view over the battlefield. So when we're surveying, we'll be able to stay in radio contact with this base. And then this little nail is the reference point for the whole battlefield survey.
The geomatic system uses the network of GPS satellites to relay signals between the team's backpacks and this base station. James and Dan are then free to roam, surveying the land to millimetre accuracy whilst on the move.
Okay, that's got the base station started.
Ready? Okay, see you later, Dan.
From the start, it's clear the Waterloo terrain is deceptive.
The most amazing area of the battlefield here, it's got all these low points. So as you're coming up through this area of the battlefield, it would appear that no matter where you were, you'd always be in a slight hollow, and then you have such difficulty getting up onto the ridgelines. It's very, very difficult terrain. It makes me wonder whether Wellington was a surveyor.
But James isn't the first member of his family to struggle through the mud at Waterloo.
Yeah, well, we had a sword in the family which is from Waterloo, with one of my ancestors' names on it, my probably great-great-great-grandfather who fought on the French side. So we must have been here on the big day, as it were. But he managed to escape.
It's unbelievable. It's boggy ground, it's really soft. Unbelievable. I don't know how they fought on this. It's bad enough making a map.
With the survey complete, all that remains is for the team to interpret the data and reveal for the first time just how the battlefield of Waterloo really appeared in 1815.
Hello, chaps. Hiya.
It's the early hours of the 18th of June, 1815. Napoleon is under pressure to attack, knowing that every minute he delays brings the Prussian army closer. Across the valley, the Duke of Wellington positions his Allied army on the Waterloo Ridge, awaiting the inevitable French attack. But what was it Wellington had seen in the terrain which made Waterloo such an ideal position for defense? Paul Hill is confident that the battlefield survey will provide an answer. When the results are plotted, the first stage is to show the battlefield as it is today, including the Lion Mound. The area where Paul believes the topsoil was removed from then shows up distinctly.
You can clearly see this circle here is the mound. And you can see quite clearly that that's been snipped off there and then pushed up. And I think by taking out the mound, we can actually get a flat area where we think most of this earth has come from.
But it's not until the Lion Mound is removed and its volume redistributed over the truncated area that Paul gets the evidence he needs. The model reveals that the Waterloo Ridge was in fact much steeper before the construction of the Lion Mound.
We can see from the model this original ridge along the top. It just gives such a commanding view over this entire area, doesn't it?
Oh yeah, for sure. And I mean, when we were there, do you remember trying to walk up this slope?
Yes.
And now,
not only have you got to walk up how it is today, but you've got another sort of, 100 metres of slope to keep going.
Essentially what it's given you is given you your battlefield back.
Still deceptively steep, the forward slope would have been an even more difficult obstacle in 1815, whilst the reverse slope would have provided precious concealment and shelter for the Allied troops behind the crest.
Despite the fact that there was a bit of truncation off the top here, we're still looking up what I think is generally speaking, the same aspect that the people had when they were coming up here. And it's a classic forward and reverse slope situation because you can't see anybody lined on the ridge up there. In fact, looking down here, even now with the truncation, you can just see the top of those telegraph poles. Well, that's what it must have been like for them. It's still a formidable slope, and waiting on the other side, of course, were the British infantry.
It's clear that Wellington's position was expertly chosen, giving the Allies the terrain advantage. But Napoleon still had more troops and greater firepower. As the Prussians marched ever closer, why did he still not attack?
If you read the accounts of the time, you sense a feeling that they wanted to get on with battle. The French were very, very confident.
Meteorologist Dennis Wheeler is fascinated by the impact of weather on major moments in history. He's convinced that the weather holds the key to understanding why Napoleon delayed. He's determined to do something that has never been done before, reconstruct precisely the weather on that day.
Well, naval logbooks contain a rich source of data, data not recorded just every day, but sometimes every hour. But it's not instrumental data, it's the observations made by officers on board deck. So you do have a very detailed picture of how the weather each day evolved almost hour by hour. It's a bit like looking at a modern day weather forecast, but written in 18th and 19th century terms. So what we have here is a piece of detective work. We've got data from different sources, we need to gather it together, and once we've got those individual pieces of information together, we can plot them on a map, and from it we can begin to reconstruct a weather map, rather like the sort of weather map we'd be all too familiar with from the television forecasts of today.
Dennis's detective work has established that in the 48 hours leading up to the battle, a low-pressure ridge brought torrential rain to the Waterloo area.
The night before the Battle of Waterloo, the weather could be described as apocalyptic. It looks as if it rained consistently through the night, and it was still raining at dawn. But sometime between 8 or 9 o'clock, the rain ceased, the sun came out, and the conditions began to become much clearer, and certainly a great deal drier.
With the clearer weather, the way seemed open for Napoleon to launch an immediate attack on the Allies, spearheaded by his most feared tactic.
The classic Napoleonic ploy for a battle is always to begin with an artillery bombardment. French artillery was very good. There were good guns, effective guns, and there were plenty of them.
Napoleon's beloved artillery was the most feared in the world, and its immense firepower was more than sufficient to blast Wellington's troops from their positions on the ridge. But even though the rain had stopped by morning, it had left a big problem for Napoleon.
When you're in the hollows around here, you've got really sticky, claggy mud. The problem is you've got a geology around here that's silty loams, and when they get wet, they get very wet and very slippery. I cannot get my shoe out of the mud, and that must have been exactly what it was like. But the mud itself, if you look at it carefully, it's incredibly fine. But when it's wet like this, these fine particles clag together, and it just becomes like putty.
Had the battle been fought only 30 to 40 miles to the southwest, we'd have had a very different situation. Nice chalky downs which would have drained very quickly indeed. But this is just the wrong area to fight in when it's been raining.
But why should mud be more of a problem for Napoleon than for Wellington?
On the morning of the 18th of June 1815, this gun was part of Napoleon's ground battery. Now, this is about as good as it gets. This gun was manufactured in 1813, it's a 12-pounder, and this should have given an artillery general like Napoleon a decided advantage. But it's very heavy. This is going to take, in ideal conditions, about 8 men to move it. That's when the ground is baked hard. But on the morning of the 18th of June, of course, the ground was like a quagmire.
Napoleon knew the sodden ground would make it difficult to maneuver his big guns, and he was gripped by a terrible dilemma. Knowing every minute's delay could be potentially disastrous, he decided to wait several tense hours for the ground to dry out. But with the Prussians closing in, was this a wise decision? What would have happened if Napoleon had pushed on through the mud regardless? By waterlogging and ploughing up an area of terrain, a team from the Royal Artillery simulate conditions on the Waterloo battlefield. They aim to investigate just how difficult it would have been for Napoleon's gun crews if he'd sent them into action without waiting for the ground to dry out.
Stand by! Go! Come on then!
Moving the heavy 12-pounders forward into position would have been just the start for Napoleon's gunners. After every shot, the half-ton guns would have had to be run back through the mud, the massive recoil having blown them yards back out of position. In the opening bombardment at Waterloo, the crews would have had to sustain this workload for an hour or more, each gun firing more than 100 rounds. The Royal Artillery team gets a taste of the fatigue caused by manning a 12-pounder at Waterloo in a point-to-point relay for just 10 minutes, a fraction of the time the French crews were in action.
Stop!
Steve Myers is a sports physiologist. By monitoring the soldiers' heart rates and blood lactate levels, he's able to measure the level of fatigue they experience.
It was a very good test. I mean, they worked incredibly hard.
During strenuous exercise, lactic acid gradually builds up until muscles tire and seize.
The lactate levels here are like maximal lactate levels. Really, you get off, so it's sort of test to exhaustion on a treadmill, these kind of levels you expect to see.
The soldiers' heart rates, too, are close to the maximum, around 180 beats per minute.
The heart rates we've got up here, interestingly what it shows is they're all, you know, close to maximal heart rates there. The sort of aerobic, fat-burning type exercise range. We saw our well-trained British gunners doing this, and they were really tired at the end of it. If you take the French artillerymen firing those guns, there's no chance that they wouldn't have been, you know, they wouldn't have been affected by fatigue. They would have been very, very tired, and they wouldn't have been able to maintain the sort of rates of fire.
With dozens of exhausted crews repeating this process alongside each other, the firing of the Grand Battery would have become sparser and the gun line itself steadily more disorganized. It's clear Napoleon made the right decision in delaying his attack. If he'd pressed on, his prized artillery could have collapsed. But he must still have been confident of the overwhelming firepower of his heavy guns, his beautiful daughters, massed together in one grand battery, ready to smash the Allied line. Finally, around midday, the French guns opened fire.
The great bombardment opens up, classic Napoleonic start to a battle. Lots of fuss and feathers, lots of noise, lots of smoke, very little effect.
Despite its huge firepower, the Grand Battery was still not as effective as it should have been. Something else was going wrong. Wellington's troops were sheltered by the reverse slope. But as well as solid cannonballs, the French were also using explosive shells, fired over the ridge crest to fall down, bursting amongst the Allied soldiers. Shellfire should have been devastating. So why at Waterloo did it have so little impact? Major Simon West is an expert on the artillery weapons used at Waterloo. He's been trying to find out why the French shellfire was so ineffective. To be sure his experiments are accurate, Simon has had hollow iron shells made, exactly like those used by the French at Waterloo. Shells were designed to burst apart, sending heavy lethal fragments in all directions. In normal conditions, this would inflict heavy casualties, but at Waterloo, the conditions were anything but normal. On Salisbury Plain, he simulates the ground conditions at Waterloo. Simon buries a 6-inch shell containing nearly 2 pounds of gunpowder only feet away from a target representing a line of Allied soldiers.
3, 2, 1, fire!
Well, this is brilliant because it was buried just below the surface, as it might have landed if it was coming in at a decent angle and buried a bit. The energy of the explosion has been absorbed by the ground and had no effect on the target, only feet away.
Amazingly, the target has escaped virtually unscathed. Although his guns pounded on, it's clear the wet ground severely reduced the effectiveness of Napoleon's grand battery. Wellington's troops had only to sit out the heavy bombardments behind the sheltering ridge. They knew that eventually the French infantry would be forced to attack across the muddy valley and up the hill. The densely packed French columns would make ideal targets for the Allied cannonballs and shells. And the Allies had another weapon, one that was not affected by the weather, the most feared of all artillery weapons: canister. It's 1 p.m. Napoleon's artillery has failed, thanks to the wet ground and Wellington's use of the sheltering terrain. But with the Prussians now close by, Napoleon dare not delay. He launches his heavy infantry attack. Advancing steadily across the muddy, exposed valley, the French soldiers have no cover. They're easy targets for Wellington's Allied artillery, above them on the ridge. The French soldiers struggle into a storm of lethal, close-quarters artillery fire. Using an original Waterloo British cannon that has not been fired in more than a century, Major Simon West investigates just how effective the Allied cannonballs would have been on Napoleon's densely packed troops. He'll load it with a 6-pound solid iron round shot, exactly what the Allied gunners would have used against the ranks of French soldiers, represented by the target 100 yards away.
Okay, right, first shot in 150 years.
Stand by. 3, 2, 1, fire!
At over 200 meters per second, the round shot is devastating. The solid iron balls would have ploughed through the packed French ranks, a single shot killing or wounding as many as 10 or 15 men.
Now, seeing the shot fired out of the cannon there, you think of that 6-pound shot having so much energy. There's no doubt that if that engaged sort of rows of cavalry or infantry in column, it would reap horrendous havoc.
But destructive as round shot could be, when the surviving French infantry closed in to point-blank range, the Allied gunners switched to the most feared artillery device of all: canister.
What I'm going to do is make up some canister charge. Canister was literally musket balls inside a thin-walled metal tube.
Simon wants to find out just why this anti-personnel device was the terror weapon of the Napoleonic Wars. The metal tube burst apart as it exited the cannon's muzzle, creating a huge shotgun effect.
Fire!
Well, considering that that frontage represents probably 6 men in file, not one of them has escaped injury. And bearing in mind that each of those balls is travelling at over 100 metres per second, even out at this range, that's going to represent a fatal injury.
Any French infantrymen lucky enough to survive the artillery fire still had to face Allied musketry. British infantry in particular were renowned for their disciplined clockwork volley fire, and at close range, their muskets could be just as deadly as canister fire. But not all soldiers' injuries at Waterloo were fatal. Retired surgeon Mick Crumplin is an expert on Napoleonic battlefield medicine. He's looking at the work of those other people on the battlefield, the French and Allied doctors. How they treated the injured, especially the walking wounded, could have a significant effect on the outcome of a battle. In order to replicate the kind of wounds surgeons would have had to treat, Mick commissions sculptor and a ballistics expert Ivan Williams. He's designed an artificial torso to take the place of human flesh and bone. Ivan shoots the torso using 3/4-inch lead musket balls from an original Waterloo period weapon. Using original 19th century surgical instruments, Mick will then attempt to show how the injuries would have been treated.
Well, I think these are just typical of the sort of wounds that would have been inflicted at the Battle of Waterloo and a surgeon would have to deal with. Of 6 injuries, one would surmise that 3 were definitely instantly fatal, 1 was presumably fairly soon fatal, and 2 were survivable with good management. The chest injuries, you can see there are 4 entry wounds. The surgeon would approach these and, as with most wounds, he would put his finger into the wound to see if the chest cavity was breached and the depth of the wound. He could use a silver probe. And you can say instantly that these 3 wounds would be mortal. Solid missiles or pieces of bone would be relatively easy to extract from a wound, as there's something to grip on, which is in great contrast to soft things like clothing and bits of belt and so forth. Using contemporary instruments, you can see that this is a relatively easy exercise.
Battlefield surgery in 1815 was primitive by today's standards, but it's always been believed that Napoleon's army had a big advantage. Celebrated French experts, such as Baron Dominique Larrey, Napoleon's personal surgeon, were thought to have developed a much more advanced system of military medicine than any other contemporary army. Throughout the Waterloo campaign, their groundbreaking treatments were thought to have speeded up the return of badly needed men to the front line, contributing much to the soldiers' morale. This could have given Napoleon the edge over the Allies. So why wasn't this the case? Mick Crumplin believes that by 1815, the British and Allied surgeons at Waterloo had become just as proficient as the French. He studied the extraordinary work of Charles Bell, a civilian British doctor who carefully recorded the injuries he encountered at Waterloo and the treatments he carried out.
Charles Bell was an anatomist, artist and surgeon from the Middlesex Hospital who travelled out amongst others, and he made 47 drawings on vellum of wounded men. The illustrations showed dress, countenance, shock, infection in the men's faces. It's an invaluable collection. It is really the photography of the Battle of Waterloo.
By 3 o'clock, the ground had begun to dry out, and the disadvantages the French artillery had suffered in the morning were reduced. But just when it seemed the French were about to regain the advantage, Napoleon himself caused the battle to take a fateful turn. Crucially, at some time between 2 and 3 o'clock, Napoleon left the battlefield. Exactly why he did this at such a critical stage is still a mystery.
There is clearly something not right with Napoleon this day. He's complaining constantly about the pains in his stomach. He's easily exhausted. This is a man in middle age who's beginning to suffer all the ailments of the middle-aged and is very conscious of it all the time.
Whatever Napoleon's condition, he was absent from the battlefield for nearly 2 hours, returning to his headquarters at Rossomme, nearly 2 miles away. He left control of the embattled French army in the hands of his second-in-command, Marshal Ney.
Ney was a superb soldier at the tactical level. If you wanted a charismatic leader to draw his sword and say to his men, "Follow me for glory," Ney was your man.
But Napoleon could hardly have chosen a worse moment to hand over command.
At about 3 o'clock, Ney looks up there onto the ridge, onto the right-hand side of the Anglo-Dutch position, and he thinks he sees the Allies retreating.
No one's absolutely certain what happened, but the best historical theory is that Wellington was adjusting some of his battalions, as he did during the course of the battle, moving some out of the firing line, moving them back to a reverse slope position. And it seems clear that Ney saw this movement taking place and thought, right, they finally cracked, they're beginning to move exactly as we always thought they were going to, and then orders an unsupported cavalry charge.
Ney thought the critical moment had come, that the French artillery had finally broken the Allied line. Whether he was unsighted by battlefield smoke or by his own sheer impetuosity, Ney seized his chance and acted.
He turns to the nearest cavalry brigade commander and he says, "Take your brigade, capture the plateau." And the cavalry brigade commander says, "No fear, Gov," or whatever the French equivalent is. Ney loses his temper, very typical of Ney, grabs Miho, who's the cavalry corps commander, and says, "Miho, take your cavalry, capture the plateau, go now."
Not only does he commit that brigade of cavalry, he commits the entire cavalry corps. So within the space of the next 30 to 40 minutes, thousands of French horsemen are committed to the battle on an area where, frankly, there is insufficient room for 2 regiments to charge, and suddenly you have 8 regiments, 12 regiments, 16 regiments.
Ney himself personally takes post ahead of them, waves his sword in the air, and the whole of the cavalry moves off down the hill and up towards Wellington's Ridge.
It was an amazing spectacle, one of the biggest cavalry attacks of the Napoleonic Wars. 5,000 sabres knee to knee, climbing the slope to put the Allies to flight. But the Allies had not broken. As the waves of French cavalry crested the ridge, they found Wellington's infantry in position on the reverse slope, formed in impregnable squares. The Allied artillery was waiting for them. The French cavalry attacked again and again, but it was impossible for them to break through the disciplined squares. Ney had made a catastrophic error of judgment.
Napoleon comes back from Rossomme, takes a look and says, "What on earth are we doing?" He then starts to organise some artillery and some infantry to put up in support of the cavalry, but it's too late, and the flower of the French cavalry is blown away.
Hundreds of cavalrymen and horses were killed or wounded, and the exhausted survivors played little further part in the battle. It was a disaster for Napoleon. With Prussian troops now closing in, the French were forced to fight on 2 fronts. Napoleon had lost the advantage. But the truth is, just as he was not the commander he once was, his army was not the fighting machine it once had been. To find out what had gone wrong with the Grande Armée, we need to go back further to the years before Waterloo. An important clue lies in a dramatic archaeological discovery in Lithuania. Just 3 years earlier, in 1812, Napoleon had embarked on the disastrous Russian campaign. More than 500,000 men marched with their emperor into Russia. It was an army of well-trained professionals, the veterans of Napoleon's most famous victories. But fewer than 1 in 10 French soldiers returned. And in spring 2002, building workers in the Lithuanian capital, Vilnius, found the last resting place of some of them. 2,000 French soldiers lie buried here in a single pit. It's the largest mass grave of Napoleonic soldiers ever found.
When we excavate such a thing, we always have a strange feeling that all these persons died and were just thrown into some kind of mass grave. It must have been something like a terror vision when they were fresh corpses.
For the first time, archaeologists can discover what kind of men made up Napoleon's Grande Armée at the height of its power.
Here you see the remains of uniform,
And there's green traces, there are most probably traces of button, just this discoloration of bones. These are from artifacts.
The soldiers had been buried in their uniforms, enabling the archaeologists to piece together the clues as to who they were. They were able to work out that these were men from the prime regiments of the Grande Armée, including Napoleon's elite Imperial Guard. And their bones revealed something else. These soldiers were not diseased. They'd been in good general health when they died.
Also young individual. Teeth are all healthy. You see the third molar just was erupting.
Aged mainly in their early to mid-20s, these were the prime soldiers of the Grande Armée, the young men who had carved out an empire for Napoleon.
It is something like the cream of the French army, actually. And even these ones, who were the strongest and the best soldiers at this period, died here during this campaign.
But the evidence that the cream of Napoleon's army died in Russia is not all that the skeletons in Vilnius reveal. Mysteriously, few of these young soldiers died of wounds. Archaeologists were at first baffled as to why they were buried in Vilnius, where there is no record of a major battle during the 1812 campaign. However, research soon showed that a much more poignant fate had befallen them. These were the men who had survived the Russian campaign. They had escaped to what they thought would be safety, and yet what actually awaited them in Vilnius was a terrible death from starvation and hypothermia. And the commander who had to stand by and watch his men die was Marshal Ney. Could the traumatic experiences that Ney suffered here in Vilnius hold the key to what went wrong for Napoleon at Waterloo? By 6:30 in the evening, the Battle of Waterloo is approaching its final bloody climax. As Prussian troops fight their way towards the Allies, Napoleon is more and more dependent on his second-in-command, Marshal Ney. But after the disastrous cavalry charges of the afternoon, Ney is becoming increasingly reckless. Mike Robinson is intrigued by Ney's erratic behavior at Waterloo. He suspects the legendary marshal, known as the bravest of the brave, may have played a crucial part in Napoleon's defeat in the battle.
Ney always led from the front. He was in the thick of it, he was in the smoke, he was in the musketry. He was a man who was so wholly involved in the battle itself that he lost sight of what was going on around him. And his passion was roused to such an extent that he lost his own self-control. He made lots of quite serious mistakes of a tactical nature throughout the day.
A veteran of more than 70 battles, Ney had always been one of Napoleon's most dependable commanders. Having joined in the ranks as a humble trooper, he was promoted general before he was 30 and made a Marshal of France by Napoleon when he was 35. But after the horrors of the Russian campaign of 1812, Ney became steadily more unpredictable.
It's difficult to tell after this lapse of time just how much that affected his later performance. Certainly he was prone to make more mistakes, both on a strategic and a tactical level. He was prone to greater outbursts of fury or passion or temper, and he was slower to calm down. And certainly his performance on the day isn't what you would expect from the man who you want to lead your army to victory.
Can modern psychology shed light on Ney's behavior? To test his theory, Mike assembles a panel of leading military psychiatrists, experts in identifying symptoms of combat fatigue in modern service personnel.
The picture that we have of Ney in the closing stages of the Battle of Waterloo is a man on the lower slopes of the Allied ridge. He's lost his hat, he's had 5 horses shot from underneath him. He's striking the barrel of a cannon with the flat of his sabre. I can't see that as normal behaviour in someone exercising that rank and those responsibilities.
The picture you've just described is a man who's just lost it completely, who is just lashing out, who's out of control, which is in stark contrast to what he should be, even as a a lieutenant or a colonel. You know, he's supposed to be in command, most of all of himself.
But could Ney's crucial loss of self-control during the battle have been due to a psychological complaint, similar to what is now recognized as combat stress? Not everyone agrees.
In terms of latter-day thinking, from the First War onwards, battle shock, combat stress, shell shock, really it's a functional diagnosis. In other words, can they function? He functions.
But he didn't function as a leader.
Yes, he did.
So in the sense of overall command, he functioned as a leader, a very junior leader, but not as a senior leader.
No, he functioned as he'd always functioned. He would always be at the front. He was the last man to step out of Russia. I don't think this is behaviour that's incongruent with him.
We have to be careful not to get into a situation where we see the diagnosis as an incapability element, that, you know, that these are people who are incapable of doing things. But what's happening is he's not thinking straight. Now that's okay. If you're a private soldier, that doesn't particularly matter. If you're a general, that's a big problem.
But having discussed the evidence, do the group believe that Marshal Ney was psychologically unfit for command?
I think he was fit. I don't think it's a psychiatrist's job to say otherwise. He was one of these men that was used, a man for all seasons. The good guys do all the hard work and do burn out. And of course Napoleon, perhaps we should question whether Napoleon was fit to serve at that time. But of course Ney, if he failed, he'd have a great scapegoat.
My feeling is that during the course of the battle, for a brief period, he experienced, I would use the term combat exhaustion. He developed tunnel vision and he reverted to type as a very junior soldier rather than functioned as a leader. In that sense, he was suffering a temporary psychological disorder that we would probably now call battle shock.
The discussion casts important new light on the part Ney would play in the last act of the battle. Around 7:30 in the evening, Waterloo reaches its final dramatic climax. After marching all day to the sound of the guns, Prussian troops have now linked up with the Allies. Time is running out for Napoleon, and his only chance is to commit the last precious reserve.
All he has left now is the Imperial Guard. The Guard have never been beaten. They're the cream of the French army, and provided they're properly used, they still just might pull victory from the jaws of defeat.
He's only going to commit the Imperial Guard at the absolute crisis of the battle. Because if he loses them, he loses the Empire. And so when the decision is made to commit the Guard, this is the crucial moment. There's no going back from this. You've got to win.
The final moments would reflect the problems Napoleon had faced throughout the whole battle. His artillery had failed against Allied troops protected by the reverse slope and soft ground. What troops he had left after years of attrition had been wasted in rash, uncoordinated attacks. Now the Imperial Guard, his last reserve, would have to attack over deceptively tough terrain, selected by a master of defensive warfare. Struggling up the difficult, muddy slope, they would have faced point-blank artillery fire, round shot and canister. Finally, command of this critical last attack was handed to a man likely suffering from battle shock, Marshal Ney. Napoleon could only look on helplessly as Ney, yelling and screaming, led the column into the dense smoke which cloaked the Allied ridge.
Noise, you can't see anything, you're trying to pick your way across obstacles, force your way through the mud. This is a pretty unpleasant movement they have to do. But they are the Guard, and despite the discharges of canister, despite the chaos, despite the difficulty, they keep going.
As the exhausted French guardsmen reached the crest of the Allied ridge, it seemed for a moment that they had broken through. But suddenly the red wall of Wellington's infantry rose from the reverse slope. From less than 30 yards, the Allied muskets couldn't miss. More than 500 guardsmen fell to the first volley alone. But no soldiers, not even the Imperial Guard, could withstand such murderous firepower. For the first and only time in their history, Napoleon's Imperial Guard broke and fled.
And once the Guards start to retreat down the hill, the whole French army breaks and the whole French army starts to withdraw. And that effectively is the end of the Battle of Waterloo.
With the end of the Imperial Guard, Napoleon's empire passed into legend and a new Europe was born, paid for in the blood of nearly 50,000 French, Allied and Prussian soldiers on the muddy, steep slopes of the Waterloo Ridge.